The ER chief locked the door from the outside and walked away laughing. Inside, alone with 3 battle-trained German shepherds that had bitten through Kevlar restraints and sent 2 grown handlers to the ER last month, stood a quiet blonde nurse in her early 30s, no weapon, no backup, no panic. The dogs didn't bark. They didn't lunge. All 3 raised their heads at the exact same moment and stared at her, like they were looking at someone they had spent years trying to find. 30 seconds later, one of them sat down. Then the second. Then the third. And the woman who everyone in that hospital had spent 6 months calling a pushover hadn't moved a single inch. Before the story goes any further, if you've never been here before, hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is where the stories that keep you up at night actually live. Hit the like button if you want more, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The first thing people noticed about Laurel Voss was that she never seemed rattled, not when the monitors screamed, not when attending physicians talked over her head like she wasn't standing right there, not when the supply carts disappeared 2 hours before a trauma surge and everyone was shouting at everyone else, and the hallway outside Trauma Bay 2 looked like the beginning of a very bad shift. Laurel just moved quietly, efficiently, without the kind of performative urgency that some of the younger nurses had picked up from watching too many medical dramas. She worked like someone who had learned, a long time ago, that panic was a luxury, and competence was survival. She was 32 years old. With blonde hair she kept in a low ponytail that was practical rather than pretty, and the kind of posture that wasn't exactly military, but wasn't exactly not either. She had transferred to Callaway Memorial Hospital in Fort Halston, Wyoming 8 months ago, coming in on a Tuesday morning with a clean personnel file, excellent references, and almost no personal details. She'd listed her prior work history simply: trauma nursing, civilian and contract, multiple postings. She didn't talk about herself much. She smiled when people asked questions and redirected with a smoothness that was almost invisible. Within a week, her colleagues had filled in the blanks themselves. She was probably divorced, probably had been through something difficult, probably moved here for a fresh start. None of them guessed correctly. But they stopped wondering quickly, because Laurel was useful, and useful people in a short-staffed trauma center tend to get absorbed into the machinery before anyone has time to be curious about them. The one person who had not absorbed her into the machinery was Dr. Gerald Fitch. Fitch was the chief of emergency services at Callaway Memorial. He was 54, with a shaved head and the slightly puffy confidence of a man who had been the most important person in every room he'd walked into for the better part of 2 decades. He was competent, genuinely competent, in the narrow way that meant he made good medical decisions under pressure and very poor people decisions in every other circumstance. He had a particular blind spot when it came to nurses who didn't announce their intelligence loudly. He liked people who pushed back, who fought for turf, who came to department meetings with their arms crossed and their opinions pre-formed. He understood that language. He knew how to respect it. Laurel didn't speak that language. She just did the work. And from the very first week, Fitch had decided, without ever stating it plainly, even to himself, that her quietness was evidence of a ceiling. Started small. He'd walk past a supply room and see Laurel organizing it and not say anything. He'd reassign her tasks mid-shift without asking, assuming she wouldn't object. Started dropping logistical requests on her, things that technically weren't nursing work, weren't her job, weren't remotely connected to her clinical role, because she always handled them without complaint. Voss, he'd say, passing her in the hallway. The rehab storage on the East Wing is a disaster. Go sort it before the afternoon intake. And she'd go. The first time, her colleague Danny Marsh watched her go and frowned. Danny was the kind of woman who complained loudly and specifically about everything, which made her both exhausting and extremely effective as an advocate. She found Laurel in the East Wing storage room 20 minutes later, working through a pile of mishandled orthopedic equipment with calm, systematic efficiency. "He does this to you twice a week," Danny said. "I know. That's not your job. Someone has to do it. Not you. You're a trauma nurse, not a supply tech." Danny crossed her arms. "You need to say something." Laurel glanced up briefly. "I'll say something when it matters. It matters now. Not yet." Danny walked out muttering. Laurel kept sorting equipment. Pattern continued through winter and into early spring. Fitch redirected her to cover the intake desk when the administrative staff called out sick, assigned her to transport duty when the orderlies were overwhelmed, and once, memorably, sent her to clean a procedure room that housekeeping had missed because he happened to walk past and see it was dirty, and she happened to be standing nearby. She did all of it. She documented none of it. She complained to no one except Danny, occasionally, in the break room, in very short sentences. What Fitch didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that she was watching. Laurel watched the way the hospital functioned. The pressure points, the inefficiencies, the spots where one competent person could prevent 3 problems simultaneously. She watched which attending physicians were reliable under pressure and which ones fell apart. She watched who the patients trusted and who they didn't. She watched Fitch, specifically his decision-making rhythm, his blind spots, his tendency to assess people based on how loudly they claimed space rather than how much space they actually occupied. She was building a picture. She didn't know yet that she would need it. The situation changed on a Thursday in April, when word came down from hospital administration that Callaway Memorial had been selected to host a 6-week rehabilitation pilot program for 3 retired military working dogs, a joint initiative between a veteran services nonprofit and the hospital's newly expanded veteran care wing. The dogs had been working animals with the U.S. military, specifically with a special operations support unit, and they were being brought in as part of an experimental program that used trained K9s in therapeutic settings for veteran patients recovering from PTSD and physical trauma. Their names were Sable, Griffin, and Mac. Sable was the youngest and the most volatile. Griffin was the largest, a male German shepherd, with a scar running from his left shoulder to the base of his rib cage from a deployment injury that had ended his field career. Mac was the oldest, a dog with a calm that read almost like weariness, and who, according to the documentation that came with him, had been assessed as resistant to strangers and required extended acclimation before any unfamiliar person was permitted to interact with him unsupervised. The handlers who accompanied them were a pair of former military personnel who now worked for the nonprofit, Sergeant First Class Roland Vane, retired, and Corporal Dana Fisk, retired. Both were experienced. Both were protective of the animals in the way that former service people are protective of the things they brought home from places they couldn't talk about. Fitch's response to all of this was bureaucratic irritation. The program was an administrative headache, and the preliminary work involved preparing the rehabilitation suite, coordinating the intake protocol, arranging the physical space so the animals had appropriate movement room was, in his assessment, exactly the kind of work he could hand off without disruption to his actual operations. He found Laurel at the nursing station on Wednesday afternoon, the day before the dogs were due to arrive. Voss. She looked up from the chart she was reviewing. Rehab Suite C needs to be converted for the K9 program intake. I need it done by 700 tomorrow. Layout specs are in the admin folder. Handle it. She held his gaze for a moment. That's not a standard nursing assignment. The most direct thing she'd said to him in 8 months. Fitch blinked, a small, almost imperceptible recalibration. I'm aware. The logistics team is overwhelmed, and you're available. I have 2 post-op patients I'm monitoring overnight. Daniels can cover them. I need this done. There was a silence that lasted about 4 seconds. Laurel was doing the kind of calculation that isn't about math. She was reading the room, reading him, deciding whether this was the moment. It wasn't. Not quite. Fine, she said. I'll handle it. Fitch walked away satisfied. Laurel spent 4 hours that evening converting Rehab Suite C into a space that was, by any reasonable standard, significantly better than what the spec sheet had called for. She moved the furniture to create clear sightlines important for animals with threat response instincts. She adjusted the ventilation baffles to reduce ambient noise. She patted the lower corners of the equipment racks because she knew from experience that stressed animals sometimes backed into corners and the metal edges could cause injury. She set up the water stations at the correct height. She checked the flooring for anything that might cause a dog with a joint injury to slip. She knew all of this not from the spec sheet, but from somewhere else, somewhere she hadn't explained to anyone at Callaway Memorial. Danny found her at 11:30 that night, finishing up. You're still here. Almost done. Danny walked around the room, taking it in. This is really good, actually. It should work for them. How do you know what K9 rehab setups are supposed to look like? A brief pause. I've read about it. Danny looked at her for a moment, then let it go. Go home, Laurel. You're back on at 6. The dogs arrived at 830 the next morning. Laurel watched from the hallway as Vane and Fisk walked them through the entrance, Sable on a short lead. Griffin moving carefully with that slight favoring of his left shoulder, and Mac bringing up the rear with the slow, assessing energy of a dog who was always running threat calculations in his head. The small crowd of hospital staff that had gathered to watch backed up instinctively when Griffin's head swung toward them. He wasn't aggressive, just imposing, in the way that a 110-pound animal with a military service record tends to be imposing. Laurel didn't back up. She was standing slightly to the side of the group, holding a clipboard she'd been using for chart notes, and she just watched. Her expression was neutral. Her body language was not tense, not casual, but still in a very specific way that dogs respond to before humans even register it as a signal. Fitch was standing near the elevator, watching the intake process with the detached interest of someone who had already mentally moved on to his next concern. He noticed that Vane and Fisk seemed satisfied with the suite setup. He made a note to tell Voss she'd done adequate work. Then his phone rang, and he stepped away to answer it, and the intake process continued without him. The actual incident happened 40 minutes later. Fisk had gone to retrieve some additional equipment from their transport vehicle. Vane was on a phone call, a brief administrative matter that he'd expected to take 5 minutes. 3 dogs were temporarily secured in the rehab suite, with the door closed. The latch was a simple hospital push handle, and Mac had figured out similar latches before, which was why Vane had planned to be back inside the room before the call ran long. Fitch happened to be walking past the suite when he heard the dogs moving inside, not aggressive movement, the restless pacing of animals in a new space, and he made a decision that reflected exactly the kind of thinking that had defined his management of Laurel for 8 months. He saw a problem, he saw a solution, and he applied them without asking anyone. He saw Laurel at the nursing station 20 feet away. Voss, the K9 suite. Go in and keep them settled until the handlers get back. Laurel looked up. The handlers aren't with them? Vane's on a call. Fisk's at the vehicle. The dogs are restless. Go. Dr. Fitch, those animals are assessed as restricted contact. I'm not a handler. Protocol says. I'm aware of the protocol. His voice had the practiced authorities of someone who had never been told no by anyone he considered a subordinate. I'm also aware that you prepared that room, which means you know the layout. And right now I need someone in there who can keep them calm. That's you. Go. She stared at him. What passed across her face in that moment was not fear. It was something much older and much more controlled than fear, the look of someone performing a very rapid assessment of a situation and finding it, on balance, survivable. Fine, she said, for the second time in 2 days. She set down the clipboard. She walked to the suite door, pushed it open, and stepped inside. Fitch watched the door close behind her, and then this was the part that mattered, the part that revealed exactly who he was. He locked it. Not out of malice, exactly. Out of laziness dressed as practicality. There was a push-button privacy lock on the exterior handle, the kind used when sensitive procedures were underway, and he pressed it without thinking hard about what he was doing. He told himself it was to prevent any well-meaning passerby from opening the door and startling the animals. Then he walked away. Inside the room, Laurel heard the click. She didn't turn around immediately. She stood just inside the doorway, back to the door, and she listened to the room. 3 large dogs at various positions. She tracked them by sound and the slight shift of air pressure. Sable was in the far corner. Griffin was to her left, behind the equipment rack. Mac was directly ahead of her, about 8 feet away, sitting with the stillness of an animal that had already made a decision and was waiting to see if it needed to act on it. She didn't move. 30 seconds passed, then 40. Then Mac stood up. He walked toward her with a deliberateness that made the hair stand up on the back of every neck of every person who wasn't in the room, which was everyone, and who would only find out later what happened next. Stopped 2 feet in front of her. His nose moved once. And then slowly, without any command, without any gesture from her, he sat down. Laurel exhaled. She lowered herself very slowly into a crouch, not submissive balanced. The posture of someone who had been in close proximity to working animals in unpredictable environments and had learned, by necessity, how to make her own body a known quantity rather than a threat. She said very quietly, Mac. The dog's ears moved forward. Sable. From the corner a shift. The younger dog turned. Griffin. The large shepherd came around the equipment rack and stood, watching her. Outside in the hallway, Vane ended his call and walked toward the suite. He reached for the handle. It didn't move. He frowned, looked at the push-button lock engaged, and felt the first cold thread of alarm move through him. Hey! He knocked twice, the sharp knock of someone used to getting immediate responses. Someone in there? Inside, Laurel didn't answer right away. She was in the middle of something. All three dogs were now positioned around her in a loose triangle, threatening the opposite. The configuration was deliberate, instinctive, the kind of positioning that working dogs use around a person they've classified as belonging to them. Finally called out, "I'm fine." "Handler outside?" "Vane. Open the door. It's locked from your side." Silence. Then she heard him working the mechanism. The lock disengaged. The door opened. Vane took in the scene, Laurel in a low crouch, all three dogs positioned around her, none of them tense, and his expression shifted through several things very quickly. He stepped back into the hallway without saying anything. Fisk had returned from the vehicle and was standing nearby. Vane looked at her. "Who is she?" he asked. Fisk watched through the open door. Mac was leaning his shoulder against Laurel's arm. Griffin had sat down beside her. Sable, the volatile one, the one who'd bitten through restraints twice in the past 3 months, was lying at her feet. "She's one of the nurses," Fisk said slowly. "Her name's Voss." Vane shook his head. "That's not how those dogs respond to a nurse." Down the hall, Fitch was walking back toward them, having remembered, belatedly, that he should probably check on the situation he'd created. He saw the open door. He saw Vane and Fisk standing in the hallway. He registered their expressions, and something in his chest tightened in a way he didn't immediately understand. He looked through the doorway. Laurel was standing now, and all three dogs were around her, not in the anxious, overstimulated way of animals in a strange environment, but in the quietly settled way of animals that had found something familiar. "She got lucky," Fitch said, to no one in particular. Vane turned to look at him. His expression was the kind of blank that is more pointed than any visible emotion. "Sir," he said, and his voice was completely level. "I've worked with these dogs for 2 years. Mac has never voluntarily made contact with a stranger. Never. Not once. Animals are unpredictable. He's leaning on her." Silence. Fitch looked back through the doorway. Mac had moved to stand beside Laurel, and his shoulder was pressed against her leg, with the quiet, uncomplicated certainty of an animal that has decided, without negotiation, that this is where it belongs. Inside the suite, Laurel looked up and met Fitch's eyes through the doorway. Her expression was calm. It was the same expression she'd had every single day for 8 months. Every time he'd handed her work that wasn't hers, every time he'd talked past her, every time he'd treated her like furniture that happened to hold a stethoscope. The same expression. But from this angle, with Mac pressed against her leg and Griffin sitting at her shoulder, it didn't read the same way. Fitch looked away first. Behind him, Vane was already pulling out his phone. He'd worked in the military long enough to know that some situations required verification, and what he had just seen was one of them. "I need to make a call," he said to Fisk. Fisk nodded slowly, not taking her eyes off Laurel. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I think you do." Vane stepped further down the hallway and brought the phone to his ear. He said 3 sentences, a name, a location, a question. Then he listened. His face went very still. He looked back at the doorway. At Laurel, who had crouched down again and was scratching behind Mac's ears with the practiced ease of someone who had done exactly this, in exactly this way, in places she had never mentioned to a single person at Callaway Memorial Hospital. Vane lowered the phone slowly. "Dana," he said. Fisk turned. "Her name isn't just Voss." Fisk didn't ask him to explain. She'd known Roland Vane long enough to read the weight in his voice, and what she heard in those 4 words, "her name isn't just Voss," was the sound of a man who had just recalibrated everything he thought he understood about the last 40 minutes. She looked back through the doorway. Laurel was still crouched near Mac, one hand resting lightly on the dog's flank, not petting him exactly, more like anchoring him, the way you'd place a hand on a surface to confirm it was solid. Griffin had moved closer and was sitting with his shoulder angled toward her, the unconscious lean of an animal that has stopped calculating risk and started calculating proximity. Sable, the one Fisk had spent 3 months being careful around. The one who'd sent a handler to urgent care back in February, with a bite that required 8 stitches, was lying flat, her chin resting on her forepaws, watching Laurel with the half-closed eyes of a dog that had decided somewhere in the past 20 minutes, that this was a safe place to be. Fisk had worked with military working dogs for 11 years. She understood their behavioral signals better than she understood most people. And what she was looking at right now was not an animal tolerating a stranger. It was not an animal being managed or controlled or carefully appeased. It was an animal that had come home. She stepped back to where Vane was finishing his call and waited. He lowered the phone with the deliberateness of someone who needs a moment before they speak. "Talk to me," she said. That was Hendricks, down at the Veterans Liaison Office in Cheyenne. Vane kept his voice low. I gave him her name. Full name Laurel Ann Voss. Ran it against the service records database they have access to. And she served. Navy. 8 years. He glanced toward the doorway. Combat medical technician, attached to a special operations support element. 3 deployments. 2 overseas, 1 in a joint theater operation I don't have clearance to know the details of. Fisk absorbed that. When did she separate? About 4 years ago. So she's been a civilian for 4 years, and she's working as a floor nurse in Wyoming. Fisk said it flatly, not as a question, because the flatness was the question, the unspoken why. Apparently. Vane pocketed his phone. Hendricks said her discharge classification was honorable, decorated, and then she just walked away from everything connected to the service. No VA benefits claimed, no veteran status flagged on any employment record, no contact with any military-adjacent organizations. He paused, like she was trying to disappear from it. Down the hall, Fitch had retreated to the nursing station and was talking to someone in a tone that suggested he was either making an excuse or building a preemptive defense. Fisk watched him for a moment. Does he know any of this? No, Vane said. And I want to keep it that way until I decide what to do with it. She looked at him. Why? Because a man who locks a nurse in a room with 3 restricted contact military dogs and walks away to take a phone call doesn't deserve the information before she does. Fisk didn't argue with that. Inside the suite, Laurel had shifted from her crouch to sitting fully on the floor, which was not a thing you were supposed to do in hospital settings, and which she had done anyway, because Mac had made it clear, in the specific way that large working dogs make things clear, that he would prefer she be at his level. He was now lying beside her with his head across her thigh. She was looking at the ceiling. Her expression was the expression of someone sitting in a quiet room after a very loud week, not peaceful exactly, but temporarily still. She knew Vane had made a call. She'd heard him step away. She'd heard the cadence of his questions, 3 short sentences, then listening, then that particular silence that follows a piece of unexpected information. She'd worked around enough military personnel to recognize the shape of a verification being run, the pattern of someone confirming a name against a record they hadn't expected to find. She didn't move. She didn't rush to explain herself. She just sat there with Mac's head on her leg and waited for what came next, the way she had learned. Over 8 years of operating in environments where rushing toward outcomes usually made them worse, to simply be still and let the situation arrive at her in its own time. Griffin put his nose against her shoulder. I know, she said quietly. I know. It wasn't clear what she was responding to, some shift in his energy, something that passed between them that didn't require translation. She scratched behind his ear, the specific spot, just behind the base where the muscle meets the skull, and Griffin closed his eyes with a long exhale. She had known dogs like him before. She had known dogs exactly like him, in other places, under other circumstances, in conditions that were nothing like this clean hospital suite with its padded corners and adjusted ventilation, and everything exactly where she'd put it the night before. She had known what it felt like to be the person who showed up when the handler was out, when the situation was bad, when the animal was hurt or frightened or both, and the only thing you could offer was steadiness, your own breathing, your own stillness, the simple fact of your continued calm presence in the space. And sometimes that was enough and sometimes it wasn't, and you learned to live with both outcomes. She had not expected to feel this again. She had left all of this behind deliberately, with both hands, because she had decided that the version of herself who lived inside that world was not the version she could sustain without it costing her things she wasn't willing to keep spending. Come to Fort Halston, Wyoming, and taken a floor nursing job at a regional hospital, and she had spent 8 months being the quiet one, the reliable one, the one who didn't make noise about her history, because her history was hers, and she'd earned the right to set it down. But some things don't stay set down when you tell them to. Mac's tail moved once, slow and certain. Laurel pressed her hand against his shoulder and breathed. The door opened. Vane stepped inside alone, closed it behind him, and crouched down against the opposite wall, a deliberate choice, she noted, to put himself at the same level rather than standing over her. Posture of a man who was about to have a conversation, not conduct an interrogation. He looked at the three dogs, then at her. "You want to tell me something?" he asked. She met his eyes. "Do you already know?" "Some of it." "Then you know why I didn't." He was quiet for a moment. Navy CMT. 3 deployments. She didn't confirm or deny. She didn't have to. "These dogs," he said carefully, were part of the 114th Special Operations Support Battalion's Working Dog Program. They came through that unit's rotations between 2018 and 2022. He paused. Combat medical technician attached to a Special Operations Support element would have had regular contact with the Medical Assessment Program for returning K9 units. "That's accurate," she said. "Did you work with them specifically?" She looked at Mac. "Not their handlers. The dogs rotated through the forward medical station when they came back injured or compromised. I was part of the team that cleared them for return to duty, or flagged them for medical reassignment." She paused. "Griffin came in twice. His shoulder injury the first time was a fragment wound. I did the initial wound management before the vet unit could get to him." Vane was very still. Sable had a stress episode after a high-noise operation in 2021. She was non-responsive to her handler for about 6 hours. I sat with her through most of it. Laurel glanced at the younger dog, still lying flat, and Mac. She stopped. Vane waited. "Mac came in alone once," she said. "His handler had been medivaced out. He was found in a staging area, wouldn't let anyone near him, was flagged for aggressive behavior and recommended for early retirement." She looked at the old dog, still heavy across her leg. "I was the one who went in to assess him." "How long did that take?" "About 3 hours." Vane exhaled through his nose. "And they remember you?" "Apparently." He stopped himself. Started again. "Dogs don't have that kind of long-term associative memory under normal circumstances. The research on it is, I know what the research says." He looked at her steadily. "Then you also know that what's happening in this room right now is not something that gets explained away as coincidence." She didn't answer. He stood up. "I'm not going to push you on what you want disclosed. That's yours to decide." He moved toward the door, then paused. "But I think you should know whoever made the call to lock that door and leave you alone in here, without a handler present, that's not something I'm going to let slide." He left. Laurel sat for another minute, alone with the 3 dogs and the sound of the hospital moving around them, the distant PA system, the wheel squeak of a cart in the hallway, the muffled pulse of a busy afternoon. Normal sounds. The sounds of a place where people came to heal. Pressed her palm flat against the floor and pushed herself to standing. Watched her, unmoving. "I have to go back to work," she told him. Tail moved again. She smoothed her scrubs, checked that her lanyard was straight, and walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the handle. She didn't look back. But her free hand dropped, briefly, and Sable, who had come to stand beside her, at some point in the last 30 seconds, without Laurel consciously registering. The movement pressed her muzzle against Laurel's fingers for exactly 1 moment before she stepped away. Laurel opened the door and walked out. The nursing station was 30 feet down the hall. Danny was there, pretending to review a chart and doing a very bad job of pretending she hadn't been watching the door to Suite C for the past half hour. "You okay?" Danny asked. "Fine, you were in there a long time." They needed settling. Danny studied her face with the particular focus of a woman who had been trying to read Laurel Voss for 8 months and had gotten approximately 12% of the way there. "What happened?" "The dogs were unsettled. I went in. They settled. Fitch locked that door." Laurel picked up her clipboard. "I know. He locked you in with 3 Laurel. He locked you in. I noticed." She flipped to the chart she'd been reviewing before all of this started. "I'm going to check on my post-op patient in room 12. Can you make sure the documentation for the K9 suite intake is filed before Fitch's 4 o'clock briefing?" Danny stared at her. "That's all you're going to say about it?" "For now." She walked away before Danny could form the next question. Conversation she'd had with Vane sat inside her chest like a stone that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to sink or stay suspended. She had spent 4 years not saying any of it. She was reasonably good at not saying things. She'd had a lot of practice, but the particular not saying that was required in the aftermath of a conversation that had already extracted part of the truth was different. It was harder. It required more active effort because the disclosure had already cracked something open. And the thing about cracks is that they don't reseal just because you stop pressing on them. She pushed through the door to room 12 and stood beside a 67-year-old veteran named Howard Driscoll, who was recovering from a hip replacement and who, in Laurel's assessment, was in more pain than he was telling anyone. "How's the hip?" she asked. "Better," he said, in the tone of a man who had spent years telling people things were fine. Scale of 1 to 10, 3. She looked at him. "Try again." A pause. 6. That's more honest. She checked his IV line, adjusted the angle of his bed by 4 degrees. "I'm going to talk to the attending about your evening dosage. Protocol they have you on is a bit conservative for where you are in recovery." He watched her. "You always do that." "Do what?" "See the thing nobody said." She didn't answer that. She finished her checks, made a note in the chart, and was almost to the door when he spoke again. "There was a nurse like you," he said. "Over in well. Doesn't matter where. Overseas. Years ago." He was looking at the ceiling. "She never made a big deal of anything. Just came in, saw what you needed, and did it. You never had to ask." He paused. "Best medical person I ever encountered, and I don't even remember her name." Laurel stood at the door. "I remember the way she moved, though," he said. "Like she'd done all of it before, and would do it again, and wasn't planning to make a ceremony out of any of it." She kept her voice even. "Get some rest, Mr. Driscoll. I'll be back before shift change." She walked out. In the hallway, she stopped for exactly 3 seconds, one hand braced against the wall. Not because she was unsteady, but because she was doing the thing she sometimes had to do, which was acknowledge privately that something had gotten through before she went back to making sure none of it showed. Then she straightened and kept moving. The shift ran long, the way Thursday shifts tended to at Callaway Memorial. 2 walk-in traumas, 1 pediatric respiratory case, and a slow afternoon that suddenly became complicated when a patient in the step-down unit spiked a fever, and the attending couldn't be reached for 20 minutes. Laurel spent those 20 minutes managing the situation with the calm that everyone around her had come to take for granted, and when the attending finally appeared, slightly flustered and ready to take charge, the situation was already contained and he had very little to do. Thanked her. She nodded once and moved on. Fitch appeared at the end of the hall at 6:45, ostensibly making his rounds, actually as Laurel had learned to read, checking on anything that might generate paperwork that could become a problem. He slowed near the nursing station, and she could tell he was deciding whether to address the incident from earlier. He didn't. He made eye contact briefly, nodded in the way that people nod when they want to project authority without inviting conversation, and kept moving. Small, cautious, recalibrating. She watched him go and thought, there it is. That particular recalibration was what happened when someone had locked a door they shouldn't have locked and was beginning to understand that they had miscalculated the weight of what they'd done. It wasn't guilt. Exactly, guilt required a level of self-awareness that Fitch hadn't demonstrated in 8 months. It was something more like the instinctive wariness a person who has sensed, without fully processing why, that the ground has shifted. What he didn't know was that Evane had spent the afternoon making 3 more phone calls. Fisk told Laurel this indirectly. She came to the nursing station at 6:15, nominally to drop off the K9 program intake documentation. And while she was doing so, she said, without preamble, "Roland's been on the phone most of the afternoon. He's reached out to the Veteran Liaison Office, the K9 program oversight coordinator at the nonprofit." And she paused, as if deciding something. "Someone at the VA Regional Command in Cheyenne. I don't know the full details. I thought you should know the general shape of it." Laurel kept her eyes on her chart. "Why are you telling me?" "Because you went into that room without hesitation, and the dogs treated you like they hadn't seen you in years, and I've been doing this work for 11 years, and I've never seen that." Fisk's voice was level, and because whoever locked that door needs to understand what they actually did. Laurel looked up at her. Fisk held the eye contact without flinching. "You don't have to tell me anything. I'm not asking." Stopped. Started again. "Those 3 dogs have had a difficult time since separation. All 3 of them have struggled with placement. Mac especially. She stopped again. And this time it wasn't strategy. It was something that Laurel recognized as personal. He's been hard to reach for a long time. And this afternoon was the first time in 2 years that I've seen him just rest. He could let something go. She looked at the folder in her hands. I don't know what that means. I just know it matters. She set the folder on the desk and walked back toward the K9 suite without waiting for a response. Laurel watched her go. The chart in front of her was not being read. Her eyes were on the words. But she was in a different room, several different rooms, in several different countries, in several different years. And she was hearing a dog's breathing slow and feeling the particular weight of a military working animal, deciding that you were safe. And she was remembering, with a precision that 4 years of deliberate not remembering had not actually blurred, exactly what it had cost her to walk away from all of it. Not the mission, not the adrenaline, not any of the things people assumed she missed. She had missed exactly this, the specific, uncomplicated trust of an animal that had seen the worst of things and was choosing, against all reasonable probability, to extend its trust to a human being. She had missed being the person that trust was extended to. She set her pen down on the chart and breathed for a moment. Then she picked it up again and kept working. At 8:30, she found Vane in the family waiting area near the veteran wing, not because she went looking for him, but because she came around a corner and he was there, sitting in one of the hospital chairs with a paper cup of coffee on his knee, and their eyes met before either of them could redirect. He didn't say anything. She sat down in the chair beside him. Not close, there was a chair's width of space between them, the practical, careful distance of two people who didn't know each other and were figuring out what they owed each other. What did Hendricks tell you? She asked. That your service record has a commendation attached to it that's partially classified. He paused. He didn't tell me what for. No, he wouldn't. He also said that you declined to have your veteran status carried forward into your civilian employment records. That you made that choice explicitly in writing at discharge. Yes, can I ask why? She thought about how to answer that. The real answer was long and complicated, and involved a version of herself she'd spent 4 years quietly editing, not erasing. Exactly. But setting aside, the way you set aside a coat that still fits, but belongs to weather you're no longer in. The short answer was simpler. Because I wanted to be treated like a nurse, she said. Not like a veteran who was nursing. He was quiet for a moment. Is that what you got? She almost laughed. No, I got treated like furniture. But that was a different problem. Fitch, among others. Vane turned the paper cup in his hands. He was a man who thought carefully before he spoke. She'd clocked that in the first hour, and she could see him doing it now. I want to be straight with you, he said. What happened this morning, the locked door, the unsupervised contact with restricted animals, that's a reportable incident under the K9 program protocol. I have an obligation to document it. I know. Which means there will be a formal account of what Fitch did. Good. He looked at her. You're not going to argue against that? Why would I? He seemed briefly uncertain, as though he'd expected more resistance. Some people prefer not to have the institutional attention. I'm not some people. He nodded once. Slow, deliberate. No. I'm starting to understand that. He stood up, tucking his phone into his jacket pocket. Formal documentation goes to the program coordinator by Friday. After that, it's out of my hands what they do with it. He looked at her. But the part about you, your service history, your familiarity with the animals, that's not going in the incident report unless you want it to be. That's my choice to make. Yes, he said. It is. He walked away toward the K9 suite. Laurel sat in the waiting area for another few minutes after he left, not thinking about anything specific or thinking about everything at once, which, from the outside, looks the same. The hospital hummed around her. Somewhere down the hall, a family was having a quiet, difficult conversation. Somewhere else, a machine was keeping someone's heart in rhythm. The ordinary machinery of a place where people came when things had gone wrong. She stood up. She had 40 minutes left in her shift, and there was a medication reconciliation she needed to finish before handoff, and Howard Driscoll probably needed his pain scale reassessed. And she was, despite everything, still a nurse in a hospital, which meant the work didn't stop because her past had decided to resurface in a way she hadn't planned for. She was almost back to the nursing station when Danny appeared from around the corner, and her expression was the expression she got when something had happened that she didn't know how to categorize. What? Laurel asked. There's a woman here, Danny said. Came in about 10 minutes ago. Not a patient. Didn't go through intake. She's in the administrative corridor. Fitch's coordinator let her through because she has credentials. But nobody knows who she is. Laurel frowned. What kind of credentials? Military. Danny lowered her voice. She's got a federal identification badge and some kind of official documentation, and she's been asking for the ER chief by name. She paused. That's not the strange part. What's the strange part? Strange part is that when Pam, Pam, the intake coordinator, when Pam asked her who she was looking for, she didn't give Fitch's name. Danny looked at her steadily. She gave yours. Down the corridor, a door opened. A woman in civilian clothes, but carrying herself in the unmistakable way of someone who had spent years in uniform, stepped into the hallway. She was in her mid-40s, sharp-eyed, with close-cropped, dark hair, and the kind of posture that didn't shift when she scanned the room. Her eyes found Laurel immediately. She walked toward her with the directness of someone who didn't navigate around things. Laurel Voss, she said. Yes. The woman stopped 3 feet away and looked at her, not assessing. Exactly. More like confirming something she'd already been told. My name is Major Patricia Dunn, she said. I'm with the Army Veteran Services Oversight Command, assigned to the Regional Coordination Office in Cheyenne. She paused. I got a call this afternoon from a retired SFC named Vane about an incident involving 3 restricted military working dogs and a civilian medical employee. Another pause. He also told me something else. Laurel waited. He told me that MacDog designation MWK447, retired 2023, difficult separation history, multiple failed acclimation attempts, voluntarily made sustained physical contact with a civilian he'd never formally been introduced to. Dunn's voice was even and factual, but something moved behind her eyes. Roland Vane has never, in 11 years of working with military dogs, seen Mac do that. I knew him before, Laurel said. I know you did. Dunn reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and produced a folded document, official, multi-page, with a federal header Laurel could partially read from where she was standing. Which is why I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly. She held out the document. Laurel took it. The header read U, Department of Veterans Affairs, Special Review Request Service Record, Voss, Laurel A. Her own name, in federal print, in a hallway in a hospital in Wyoming. She looked up at Dunn. When you separated, Dunn said carefully, your service record was flagged for a commendation review that was never completed. An oversight, the unit was deactivated before the process finished. She held Laurel's gaze. I've been looking at this file for 3 hours, and I need to know why a decorated combat medical technician with your record is working in a regional hospital under a filing that lists no military service history. Corridor was very quiet. At the nursing station, Danny had stopped pretending to work. Further down the hall, she could see Vane standing near the entrance to the K9 suite, watching. Fitch came around the corner from the administrative wing and stopped walking. He took in the scene. Laurel, a woman with federal credentials, an official document, changing hands, and something shifted in his expression that Laurel saw clearly even from 30 feet away. Not guilt, not quite, but the beginning of understanding that this situation had grown considerably beyond anything he knew how to manage. He didn't speak. He just stood there, watching, with the document in Laurel's hands between them like something that couldn't be put back. Dunn had not looked at Fitch. She was still looking at Laurel. Commendation review, she said. If we open it, and based on what Vane reported, I believe we have grounds to. It's going to involve a full accounting of your service history. Everything you filed away. She paused. I need to know if you're prepared for that. Laurel stood in the fluorescent light of a hospital corridor in Wyoming, with 3 military working dogs 30 feet behind a closed door and a federal document in her hands, and the quiet, certain weight of 8 months of being underestimated, pressing against the inside of her chest like something that had finally run out of room. She looked at the document. She looked at Dunn. Yes, she said. And across the corridor, behind the closed door of Suite C, something moved all 3 dogs, shifting at once and in the silence between one breath and the next. Before anyone said anything else, the sound of Mac's low, certain exhale carried through the gap at the bottom of the door like an answer that had been waiting a long time to be given. Part 3, Dunn didn't wait for the moment to settle. She was already moving not away, but sideways, angling her body to include the corridor in her field of view, while keeping Laurel in the center of it. Practiced spatial awareness of someone who'd spent years in environments where knowing where everyone was standing mattered. "Let's find somewhere to sit," she said. It wasn't a question. Laurel folded the document and held it. "There's a consultation room at the end of the veteran wing, usually empty after 7. Lead the way." She didn't look at Fitch as she passed him. She didn't need to. She could feel him standing there, the particular stillness of a man, watching a situation migrate from something he understood into something he didn't, and that feeling was enough. She kept walking. Danny pressed herself against the wall as they went by, and Laurel caught her eye for just a second. Danny's expression asked approximately 14 questions. Laurel's answered none of them. The consultation room was empty. It smelled like industrial cleaner and stale coffee, with the particular undertone of a room that had hosted too many difficult conversations, the kind that settled into the walls over years and didn't quite ventilate out. There was a table, 4 chairs, a window that looked at a concrete wall, and a whiteboard someone had partially erased, leaving the ghost of a flowchart that hadn't been important enough to finish removing. Dunn sat. Laurel sat across from her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Dunn opened the second page of the document and set it on the table between them. "Your unit was deactivated in late 2022, she said. "The 114th Special Operations Support Battalion. Administrative dissolution. Post-drawdown. Commanding officer at the time, Colonel Ward, submitted a commendation packet for 4 personnel before the unit was formally closed. 3 of those commendations were processed within 60 days. She tapped the page. Yours wasn't. Laurel looked at the document. The paper had the specific weight of official things heavier than it looked, in ways that weren't physical. Why not? Because your separation paperwork was filed through a different administrative channel. You separated 3 weeks before the formal dissolution. Packet got routed to a deactivated unit code. It sat in a processing queue for 18 months before anyone flagged it." Dunn paused. "That's the bureaucratic version of what happened. Practical version is that a commendation you earned was never officially entered into your record, and for 4 years, nobody knew to look for it. I didn't report the gap." "No," Dunn said. "You didn't. Which is why I'm here in person instead of sending a letter." Laurel's eyes moved across the page. She was reading quickly and absorbing it the way she absorbed everything, not performing the reading, just actually doing it. The language was dense and specific, and she understood most of it, and the parts she didn't understand were about administrative process rather than substance. Commendation was for an incident in. She stopped. "You know what it was for," Dunn said quietly. "Yes. Do you want to tell me, or do you want me to read it from the file?" Laurel set the document down. She looked at the wall for a moment, not the ghost flow chart, just the wall itself, something neutral to land on. There was a situation, a staging area. We had 2 injured handlers and 3 working dogs who'd been in a high-intensity operation for 11 hours. One of the dogs was in medical distress dehydration, heat stress, a laceration on his left flank that was deeper than it looked. The handlers were compromised, and the veterinary support was 40 minutes out. And I managed the dog's injury while simultaneously coordinating the medevac for the handlers and maintaining the perimeter assessment until the relief team arrived. She said it the way. She said everything flatly, accurately, without embellishment. I wasn't supposed to be the primary on any of it. I was supposed to be backup medical for the secondary team. But the primary medic had been rotated out that morning for a different deployment, and the replacement hadn't arrived yet. So you ran it alone. I ran what needed running. Dunn looked at her steadily. Colonel Ward's commendation language describes it as, and I'm quoting directly, "exceptional judgment and composure under conditions of simultaneous medical emergency and personnel compromise, resulting in preservation of both human and working animal assets in circumstances where a less experienced or less disciplined technician would likely have failed." She closed the folder. He also wrote, in his personal addendum, that you were the most naturally gifted medical combat technician he had observed in 23 years of service. The room was very quiet. "He never told me that," Laurel said. Ward wasn't a man who said things directly if he could write them in a report and file them somewhere. Dunn's voice held the faint edge of someone who had known the colonel personally. He believed documentation was more durable than conversation. A pause. He wasn't wrong. It's why this file still exists. Laurel sat with that for a moment. The information arrived in her chest not as vindication. She hadn't been waiting for vindication, but as something more complicated. Like finding a letter you wrote years ago to a version of yourself that no longer needed it, but reading it anyway, because the handwriting was yours. What does the review involve? She asked. Formally, we complete the commendation processing. It gets entered into your official service record. You receive the documentation. Dunn leaned forward slightly. Practically, and this is the part I need to be honest with you about, it generates a record entry that has your full service history attached, your veteran status, your combat medical certification, everything you filed away when you separated. She met Laurel's eyes. It becomes part of your permanent record, which means anyone who runs your credentials as a medical professional will see it, including employers. Laurel was quiet. Dunn waited. And the waiting was good. It wasn't impatient. Wasn't pressing, just present. The waiting of someone who understood that some responses needed a moment before they were ready. And the incident this morning, Laurel said. Fitch locking that door. That's a separate matter. But not unrelated. Dunn's expression didn't change, but something in her posture did a small adjustment that meant she was about to say something she'd been building toward. K9 Program Oversight Coordinator received Vane's incident report 2 hours ago. Protocol violation: an unqualified civilian placed in unsupervised contact with restricted military working dogs triggers a mandatory review of the hospital's agreement with the Veteran Services Program. She paused. Which means there will be an external review of this facility's compliance with the program terms, including the conduct of the personnel who made that decision. Laurel thought of Fitch standing in the corridor, watching. He won't have been told that yet, she said. No. The notification goes to hospital administration tomorrow morning. For a very brief moment, something moved across Laurel's face that wasn't quite satisfaction, but lived in the same neighborhood. Then it was gone. She was too disciplined to let it stay. Is there anything you need from me tonight? A statement, written or verbal, your choice. About this morning, what Fitch said, what he did, your experience inside the suite. Dunn produced a small recording device and set it on the table between them. Whenever you're ready. Laurel looked at it. 4 years of having set everything down, and now here was someone asking her to pick it back up. Not the service itself, but the record of it. The official account. The version that would exist in files and systems and permanent records. The version that would mean the next person who looked at her would see something different from what Fitch had seen. She leaned forward and pressed the record button. This morning, she said, at approximately 10:20, Dr. Gerald Fitch, Chief of Emergency Services at Callaway Memorial Hospital, instructed me to enter the K9 rehabilitation suite without any formal handler clearance, without K9 program authorization, and without any professional basis for the assignment beyond his own convenience. She didn't stop for another 12 minutes. When she finished, Dunn stopped the recording, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Dunn said, For what it's worth, and I know this isn't what the formal process is about what Vane described this afternoon, the way those dogs responded to you. She paused. I've been in this work long enough to know that military working dogs don't extend that kind of trust easily, or quickly, or without reason. She looked at Laurel directly. Whatever you chose to walk away from when you separated, those dogs have been carrying the weight of their service history every single day since. And this afternoon, they found someone who understood what that weight felt like. She closed her folder. That matters, regardless of what the paperwork says. Laurel looked at her hands on the table. She said nothing, but she didn't look away. She got back to the nursing station at 9:47, 13 minutes before the end of her shift. Danny was still there, because Danny was always still there. Reliable and relentless in the way of people who genuinely couldn't let things go. Well, Danny said, I gave a statement about this morning. Danny's eyes widened. To a federal official, yes, about Fitch, among other things. Danny stared at her. Laurel, I know what he's going to do. She picked up her bag. Going to find out tomorrow morning that the Veteran Services Program is opening a compliance review of his conduct, and he's going to try to get ahead of it. She looked at Danny steadily. I need you to tell me honestly if he comes to you for support. If he tries to build a narrative about this being a misunderstanding or a staff communication failure, or anything else, what are you going to say? Danny held her gaze. I'm going to say that I watched him hand you non-nursing work twice a week for 8 months, and never once questioned it, and that I should have said something a long time before this. Laurel nodded once. Good. She picked up her bag. Go home, Danny. She left before Danny could say anything else. Parking lot at 9:50 was the parking lot of every late shift she'd ever worked, cold, poorly lit, quiet, in the way that institutional buildings are quiet after dark. The sound of the HVAC system carrying further than it should, and the distant sound of a vehicle on the main road, providing the only texture in an otherwise flat silence. She sat in her car for 3 minutes before starting the engine. Not thinking, not deciding anything, just sitting. Then she drove home. She did not sleep well. The next morning arrived at 5:45 with an alarm she'd set for 6 and a body that had given up on the last 15 minutes as a lost cause. She lay in bed for a moment looking at the ceiling, doing a rapid inventory of the things she'd put in motion the night before and could not now take back. Statement, the document, the commendation review, Dunn's card on the kitchen table where she'd set it when she came in. She got up, showered, drove to work. The shift started at 7. She was there at 6:40. First indication that things had already begun to move was that Fitch arrived at 6:50, 10 minutes earlier than his usual time, and he walked past the nursing station without speaking to anyone, which was unusual, and went directly into his office, which he didn't leave for 40 minutes. The second indication was that the hospital administrator, a quiet, meticulous man named Director Elias Bohm, was in the building before 8, which never happened on a regular Friday. He went to Fitch's office. He was inside for 22 minutes. When he came out, his expression told Laurel nothing specific. Bohm was professionally opaque in the way that hospital administrators tended to be, but the direction he walked afterward was toward the administrative conference room, and he made a call on his cell phone before he reached it. Danny appeared at Laurel's elbow at 8:15. Bohm's been in with Fitch. I know. Whatever that woman told administration last night, it wasn't what she told them. It's the formal incident report from the K9 program. Danny absorbed that. What happens to Fitch? That depends on what Bohm decides to do with it. Laurel kept her eyes on the chart she was updating, and what the compliance review finds. The morning ran. She saw patients. She did her job. She was aware, in the peripheral way of someone who is experienced at maintaining focus while monitoring a situation, that the administrative wing was having a different morning than the clinical wing, that doors were opening and closing at intervals that suggested multiple conversations, that Fitch had come out of his office twice and gone back in, that Bohm had made at least 2 more calls. At 10:20, almost exactly 24 hours after the incident in the K9 suite, Vane appeared at the nursing station. Morning, he said, morning. She kept writing. The dogs had a good night. Mac ate well, which Fisk said hasn't happened consistently in about 3 months. He paused. She wanted me to tell you. Tell her I'm glad. He leaned against the counter. The program coordinator is coming in this afternoon. Dr. Priya Okafor. She runs the nonprofit's clinical oversight. She'll be reviewing the incident documentation and meeting with whoever Bohm designates. He paused. She'll probably want to talk to you. I'll be here. She'll also want to observe the K9 suite interaction. Part of the compliance protocol is documenting the animal's behavioral state following an incident. He looked at her sideways. I thought you should know that, because the documentation process involves filming the dogs in the suite environment, and if you happen to be nearby, you're asking me to be present. I'm informing you that the observation is scheduled for 2 o'clock. She looked up from the chart. He met her eyes and held them, and there was something in his expression that was close to the expression of someone who had decided to be straightforward and was slightly surprised to find it felt better than being cautious. 2 o'clock, she said. Yes. He left. At 11, Fitch's office door opened, and he walked out with the specific purposefulness of a man who had decided that the best defense was a visible offense. He came to the nursing station. He stood with the posture of someone who had practiced this approach. He looked at Laurel. I need to talk to you, he said. She finished the entry she was making, clicked the pen, looked at him. Okay. Not here. She followed him to the consultation room, the same one she'd sat in with Dunn the night before, which felt like a detail the universe had arranged for its own entertainment. Closed the door. He didn't sit down. I've been told there's a compliance review being opened, he said, related to the incident yesterday morning. Yes. I want to be clear about what happened. His voice had the particular tone of someone managing their own narrative, not quite defensive yet, but building toward a position. The decision to have you enter the K9 suite was a practical one. The handlers were temporarily unavailable, the animals were restless, and you had just spent several hours preparing the space. I assessed that you were familiar with the environment. Laurel looked at him. That's not an accurate description of why you sent me in, she said. I used my judgment as chief of emergency. You sent me in because you assumed it would be difficult, and you wanted to see what I'd do. Her voice was even. Not loud, not heated. Even. You've been doing that for 8 months. Assigning me work outside my role, tasks below my qualifications, situations you expected me to struggle with. Because you decided without any evidence that I didn't have the capacity to object or the competence to handle anything more than what you handed me. She paused. That's what happened. The compliance review is going to find the same thing. Fitch stared at her. The stare was the stare of a man whose carefully constructed framing had just been taken apart in 6 sentences, and who had not prepared for the person across from him to be this direct. He started. I've documented every non-role assignment you've given me for the past 6 months, she said. Dates, times, scope of task, deviation from nursing role classification. Danny Marsh witnessed most of them. 2 other nurses on the floor can speak to the pattern. She let that land. I didn't file it anywhere, because I was deciding whether. Now I've decided. The room was very still. Fitch sat down. Not because he'd chosen to, but because his legs made the decision for him. Why didn't you say something earlier? He said. And the question had lost its authority. It was the question of a man genuinely trying to understand something, which was a different version of him than she'd encountered before. Because I was watching, she said. Because I wanted to understand the full scope of it before I said anything. And because I've spent enough time in environments where speaking too early costs you more than waiting does. She looked at him. But there's also this. I didn't want to be the nurse who made it about her. I wanted to be the nurse who did the work. I just didn't expect the work to keep expanding, to include things that weren't mine. He looked at the table. He didn't look like a villain in that moment. He looked like a tired, middle-aged man who had been running on the certainty of his own judgment for so long that its first serious failure had genuinely surprised him. I made assumptions about you, he said. Yes, they were wrong. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. The federal officer, Major Dunn. She's here about more than the incident. Yes, Laurel said, she is. He looked up at her, and she could see the moment it arrived. The moment he understood that the quiet nurse he'd spent 8 months underutilizing and underestimating had a history that made his assessment of her not just wrong but absurdly, specifically wrong in ways he couldn't yet fully see. She didn't help him understand it faster. She waited. What's in your record? He asked. That's between me and the review process. He nodded slowly. He looked like a man being rearranged from the inside. She stood up. The program coordinator arrives at 1. The compliance observation is at 2. I'd suggest you make yourself available to Director Bohm before then. She left him in the room. The afternoon arrived, with the particular density of afternoons that matter. Dr. Priya Okafor was a compact, precise woman in her early 50s who moved through a space like someone accustomed to assessing it rapidly and finding the relevant information. She arrived at 1, met with Bohm for 45 minutes, reviewed Vane's incident documentation, and at 1:58 walked into the K9 suite with a small video camera and a tablet loaded with the program's behavioral assessment protocol. Vane and Fisk were already there with the dogs. Laurel was at the nursing station, 30 feet down the hall, writing chart notes. At 2:03, Fisk came out of the suite and walked to the nursing station. Okafor wants you in the room, she said. Why? Because when she came in, all 3 dogs looked at the door and then looked at her, and then looked at the door again. Fisk kept her expression neutral. She asked Vane if there was someone on the other side of the door they were expecting. He said he thought there might be. Laurel set down her pen. She walked to the suite. She pushed open the door, stepped inside. All 3 dogs turned. Sable made a sound, not a bark, something lower and more specific, the vocalization of an animal expressing recognition. Griffin crossed the room in 4 steps and stopped in front of her. Mac, who had been lying down, stood up with the deliberateness of an old dog who had decided the effort was worth making. Okafor was filming. She filmed Griffin sitting at Laurel's feet. She filmed Mac, pressing his shoulder against Laurel's leg. She filmed Sable, coming to stand beside them, completing the triangle. Then she lowered the camera slightly and looked at Laurel. Vane tells me you knew these dogs in service, she said. In what capacity? Combat medical. I provided veterinary support overlap when the primary vet unit wasn't available. 3 came through my station on multiple occasions. Okafor looked at the dogs. She looked at Laurel. She looked at the footage on her camera's playback screen. The behavioral pattern I'm observing is consistent with sustained primary bonding, not casual familiarity. She paused. Do you understand what I'm saying? These dogs recognize me as a trusted handler-adjacent figure from their service period. More than adjacent. Okafor set the camera down on the table and looked at her directly. Ms. Voss, this program has been trying to find stable therapeutic placement for these 3 animals for 14 months, especially. His behavioral resistance to new handlers has been our primary obstacle. She gestured at the room at Mac's posture, Griffin's proximity, Sable's settled stillness. What I'm seeing right now is the most behaviorally stable I've observed any of them since the program began. Laurel said nothing. I'm going to ask you something, Okafor said, and I want you to take a moment before you answer. She waited. Would you be willing to be formally assessed as a handler-adjacent support person for this program? It would involve training certification, not extensive, given your background and a regular schedule with the dogs during their therapy rotations. She paused. It would also require that your service history and qualifications be formally documented as part of your professional record here. The room was completely quiet. Mac exhaled against Laurel's leg. She looked down at him. At Griffin, sitting with the patience of an animal that had been through things that required patience to survive. Sable, whose volatile edges had, in this room, in this hour, gone soft. She looked up at the door. Through the window set into it, she could see the hallway, could see Fitch standing 30 feet away, not quite watching but not quite not watching, and beside him, Director Bohm, who had just arrived from the administrative wing, with the expression of a man who was in the middle of rearranging his understanding of what had been happening in his hospital. She could see Danny at the nursing station, pretending to type. She could see Vane, standing near the door, who gave her nothing, no expression, no signal, just the quiet, steady presence of someone who had made his call yesterday and was waiting to see what she made of hers. And she thought, briefly and specifically, of Howard Driscoll in room 12, telling her about a nurse he couldn't name, who he'd never forgotten, the one who saw the thing nobody said, who moved like she'd done all of it before and would do it again. She thought of what it had cost her to set all of it down. She thought of what it had cost to carry it silently instead. Yes, she said, I'm willing. Okafor nodded once. She picked up her camera and her tablet. I'll need the documentation from your service record to complete the assessment. Major Dunn indicated she'd already initiated the review process. She has. Good. Okafor moved toward the door, then paused. She looked at Laurel with the directness of someone who was about to say something she didn't usually say. For what it's worth, the work you did last night. Giving that statement, it would have been easier, not Tummins. A lot of things are easier, Laurel said. That doesn't make them right. Okafor held her gaze for a moment. Then she opened the door and walked out into the hallway, and Laurel heard her say to Director Bohm, clearly and without preface, we need to talk about the structural changes to the program agreement, and we need to talk about the personnel decision that triggered this review. Bohm's response was quiet, but Laurel caught the shape of it, the tone of a man shifting from passive observation to active accountability. Turned back to the room, Mac was still against her leg. Griffin had settled. Sable was lying down again, with the slow certainty of an animal that had made its final decision about a place, and found it acceptable. Laurel put her hand on Mac's shoulder. She was standing inside a hospital room in Wyoming, in scrubs, with her shift half-finished and her chart notes unwritten, and her service record being unsealed after 4 years and a compliance review unfolding in the hallway, and a man in an office somewhere behind her beginning to understand the full weight of 8 months of wrong assumptions. None of it was clean. None of it was simple. She was tired, and she still had 6 hours of shift left, and there were parts of this she hadn't decided how she felt about yet. But Mac's breathing was even and steady, and his shoulder was warm under her hand. Stayed for another minute. Then she said, I have to go back to work. She walked to the door and pushed it open. In the hallway, Bohm was still talking with Okafor, but he looked up when she emerged, and the look was different from every look she'd gotten from administration in 8 months. It was the look of someone seeing a person they should have been seeing for a long time. She nodded at him once, professionally, and turned toward the nursing station. 15 feet away, a door opened. Not Fitch's door, not any door she'd been tracking. It was the door to the administrative records office, and the person who walked out was someone she had not seen in 4 years, a man in civilian clothes, with a military bearing that 8 months of desk work hadn't flattened, carrying a thin folder with a federal seal on the cover. Stopped when he saw her. She stopped. Her face did something it very rarely did. It lost its composure just for a second, not in fear, but in the specific shock of a thing you had stopped expecting and had therefore stopped preparing for. Laurel, he said. She knew that voice. She knew that face. She knew that specific way of standing the left shoulder slightly lower, an old injury that never quite corrected. Colonel Ward, she said. He looked at the folder in his hand. He looked at her. I came to finish something I should have finished 3 years ago, he said. I heard about the incident yesterday. I heard about the review. He paused. I heard about the dogs. His voice was steady, but his jaw was tight, and she could tell, because she'd worked with him long enough to read him, even when he didn't want to be read, that he was holding something he'd been carrying for a while. I should have made sure the commendation was processed before I signed the dissolution paperwork, he said. That was my failure. Not the system's, mine. She looked at him. What's in the folder, she asked. He held it out. She took it, opened it. The first page was a formal commendation document. Her name, her service number, the colonel's signature, dated 3 years ago, and beneath it, a second signature, dated yesterday. The second page was something else entirely. She read it once, then read it again. Her expression didn't change, but she went very still, in the specific way that people go still when something has arrived that is too significant to react to immediately. Ward, she said quietly, what is this? It's what should have been in your file the first time, he said, and what I should have fought harder to include. She looked at the second page. It was a formal commendation upgrade above the standard classification into a tier that required command-level authorization and federal review. The language was Colonel Ward's, clipped and factual and specific, the same prose style as everything he'd ever written. At the bottom of the page was a section she hadn't expected. A list of names, personnel, witnesses to the incident in the staging area, the one she'd described to Dunn the night before. 6 names with their ranks and current statuses noted. 5 of them had signed. The 6th line was blank. She looked up at Ward. The 6th witness, she said. Who is in this hospital right now, he said. Has been for the past month. Stared at him. Room 14, he said quietly. Veteran wing. She looked down the hallway toward the veteran wing. Toward room 12, where Howard Driscoll was recovering from a hip replacement, talking to nurses he'd probably forget, and not forgetting a medic he couldn't name. Room 14. She hadn't been in room 14. She had deliberately not been in room 14 because the name on the intake roster had been there when she'd reviewed the veteran wing census 3 weeks ago, and she had seen it, and she had made a choice, and she had not revisited that choice once in 3 weeks. She knew who was in room 14. Ward watched her face. To see you, he said. When he found out you were here. He's been asking since the 2nd week. He paused. I think he stopped asking because he assumed you wouldn't come. The folder was heavy in her hands. Down the hall, the veteran wing door was closed. Behind it, room after room of people who'd carried things home from places they couldn't talk about. And one of those rooms held someone whose name she had been managing not to think about for 4 years. Her hands, which were steady in every crisis she'd walked through, in every procedure, every emergency, every moment that required steadiness, were not entirely steady right now. Laurel, Ward said. She looked at him. Whatever happened between you and Marcus Holt before you separated, he said carefully. The man in room 14 isn't the same person he was then. The name hit the air between them and stayed there. Marcus Holt. She hadn't said it in 4 years. The name stayed in the air between them for a long moment, and Laurel did not react to it the way she'd expected to. There was no sharp intake of breath, no visible flinch, just a slight tightening around her eyes that Ward, who had known her well enough to read that particular signal, noted and did not comment on. She looked at the folder in her hands. Then she closed it. I have patience, she said. I know. And 6 hours of shift left. I know that too. She looked at him. He looked back. Ward had never been a man who pushed. He'd been a man who placed information in front of people and then waited for them to decide what to do with it, which was either wisdom or a very refined form of patience, and she'd never entirely settled on which. Think about it, she said. She walked back to the nursing station, with the folder under her arm. And she did not think about Marcus Holt for the next 47 minutes, through pure, practiced effort of will through medication reconciliation and addressing change on a post-surgical patient in room 9, and a phone call with a specialist in Cheyenne about a patient whose discharge criteria were more complicated than the attending had initially assessed. She was thorough, and she was present, and she was for 47 minutes, entirely the nurse and nothing else. Then she sat down at the nursing station with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and the folder was still there, and she opened it to the second page and read it again. The names of the 6 witnesses were listed in the order they had been contacted. She knew 4 of them from the deployment people she'd worked beside, eaten beside, managed emergencies beside. Their signatures were clean and certain, the signatures of people who had no ambivalence about what they'd seen. 5th signature was Ward's own. The 6th line said, Captain Marcus Holt U.S. Army retired, currently receiving care, Callaway Memorial Hospital, Fort Halston, Wyoming. Unsigned. Waiting, she closed the folder. Danny appeared from around the corner with the instincts of a woman who could read an atmosphere shift at 30 paces. She looked at the folder. She looked at Laurel's face. She opened her mouth. Don't, Laurel said. Danny closed her mouth. She sat down in the adjacent chair, picked up her own chart, and worked in companionable silence for approximately 4 minutes before she couldn't help herself. Bad? She asked quietly. Laurel picked up her pen. Complicated. Complicated like hospital politics. Complicated, or complicated like something that was unfinished and is now sitting in a room down the hall, waiting for me to decide what to do about it. Danny absorbed that. Is the something a person? Laurel said nothing, which was Danny had learned over 8 months its own kind of answer. The afternoon moved in the stop-start way of afternoons that have too much happening in too many concurrent streams. At 2:40, Bohm called a department heads meeting that was not on the calendar, and Fitch attended it with the expression of a man who already knew the shape of the conversation waiting for him inside. Through the glass wall of the conference room, Laurel could see Bohm at the head of the table, Okafor and Dunn to his right, Fitch across from them, with his hands flat on the table, in the posture of someone who was deciding, in real time, whether to fight or concede. Fought. She could tell from his posture, the forward lean, the 2 points where he interrupted, the moment where he spread his hands in the gesture people use when they want to reframe something as a misunderstanding. Couldn't hear the words through the glass, but she'd been reading situations for long enough that the words were almost secondary. Okafor spoke for approximately 8 minutes straight, without interruption. Whatever she said, it landed. Fitch's posture changed in the way postures change when the structural argument is lost, and what remains is only the management of consequences. Laurel looked away. She had a patient to check on. Howard Driscoll was sitting up in bed, which was an improvement from yesterday, and his color was better, and his pain scale had dropped to a 4 that she actually believed. He'd eaten most of his lunch. He was watching something on a small television mounted on the wall, with the half-attentive focus of a man whose mind was elsewhere. Afternoon, she said. Afternoon. He muted the television. You look like you've had a day. I've had a day and a half. She checked his chart, assessed the surgical site clean. No signs of infection. Inflammation tracking correctly. Hips responding well. I talked to Dr. Albright this morning. She's thinking Monday for your first PT assessment. Monday. He said it with the resigned acceptance of a man who knew physical therapy was going to be unpleasant and was prepared to do it anyway. Fine. You always say that. I only say it when I mean it. She adjusted his IV line. You need anything? He was quiet for a moment. Then you know that nurse I mentioned. Yesterday. She kept her hands moving on the chart. I remember. I was thinking about it last night. Couldn't sleep. Started going back over it. He looked at the wall. She had this way of doing things efficient, but not cold, you know? Like she cared about the outcome, but wasn't going to be dramatic about it. He paused. I never saw her rattled. Not once. And we were in some pretty rattling situations. Sounds like she was good at her job. She was the best I've seen. He glanced at her. Reminded me of you. Actually. The efficiency. The way you don't make a production of things. Laurel looked at him. He looked back. For a moment, a brief, specific, careful moment, she considered it. Proximity of the truth. The fact that it was sitting between them, in this small room, like something waiting to be acknowledged. She thought about Ward, and the folder. and the unsigned sixth line. Thought about room 14. Get some rest, she said. I'll be back before shift change. She walked out before the moment could become something that required a response she hadn't decided on yet. In the hallway, she stopped. Down to her left was the nursing station, the conference room, the controlled chaos of the afternoon shift. Down to her right was the veteran wing, and behind one of those doors was a man she hadn't spoken to in 4 years, who had apparently been asking to see her for 3 weeks and had stopped asking because he'd assumed she wouldn't come. She stood in the hallway for exactly 30 seconds. Then she turned right. Room 14's door was half open. She knocked twice on the frame and heard a sound that might have been acknowledgement and pushed it the rest of the way. Marcus Holt was 41 years old and looked at this particular moment about 50. Not in his face. His face was the same face she remembered, or the same structure of it, same jaw, same forehead, but in the way he was carrying himself in the hospital bed, careful stillness of a man who was managing pain and had gotten practiced enough at it that the management had become its own kind of exhaustion. His left leg was elevated. The chart on the door had indicated a tibial fracture, complicated, surgical, the result of an injury he'd apparently sustained 6 months ago, and which had taken long enough to properly diagnose and treat that it had progressed from manageable to requiring intervention. He saw her in the doorway. He didn't say anything immediately. He just looked at her, and she stood there and let herself be looked at, and the room was very quiet. Laurel, he said finally. Marcus, not Captain, not Holt. Those 4 years had done something to the formality, stripped it down to first names in the way that time strips things down, whether you want it to or not. She came inside. She didn't sit down. She stood at a professional distance, not cold, but bounded, and she looked at his chart, because it gave her hands something to do, and her eyes somewhere legitimate to land. Tibial fracture, she said. Post-surgical. You're in week 3. Week 3.5. His voice was lower than she remembered, or maybe just different in a room with no ambient noise to blend into. The infection set it back. I saw that in the chart. She put the chart down. How's the pain management? Acceptable. He paused. Which is medic speak for not great but functional. I know what it's medic speak for. A silence. Not hostile, just the silence of 2 people who had known each other in a specific context and were finding the edges of a different one. Ward told me you were here, he said, 2 days ago. He told me you were here this afternoon. I asked him not to push it. His jaw tightened slightly. I didn't want you to feel cornered, she said. Something like that. She looked at him. The complicated thing about Marcus Holt, the thing that had made the last year of her service difficult in ways she had never fully explained to anyone, was that he was not a simple person to be angry at. He was not a villain. He had not done a villainous thing. He had done a human thing, a wrong thing, and it had cost her something, and the wrongness and the humanity were so tangled together that she had spent 4 years choosing not to examine the knot too closely. Folder, she said. The commendation. Your signature's missing. I know. Ward said you'd sign it. I will. He held her gaze. I wanted to see you first. He stopped. Owed you an explanation before I owed you a signature. She said nothing. She let him continue. What I reported, he said, at the end of the last deployment. The incident review. He kept his voice level, and she could tell it was costing him. I framed it in a way that minimized your role. I filed my assessment first, before yours was submitted, and I used language that when the review board read both accounts, made it look like you'd exceeded your scope of authority, which triggered the additional scrutiny on your separation package. She already knew this. She had known it for 4 years. But hearing it said plainly, in his voice, in a room where there was no ambient noise and no professional cover, landed differently than knowing it had. Why? She asked. Not angry she'd burned through the anger a long time ago. Just asking. Because I was wrong about a decision you overrode, he said, and I couldn't admit that to the review board, so I reframed the sequence to make it look like the problem was your decision-making, rather than mine. He looked at his hands. I told myself it was because the outcome was acceptable, and a full account would create unnecessary complexity. He stopped a lie, she said. Yes. She stood there. The thing about being in a hospital, she'd thought more than once, was that it made the ordinary transactions of human failure very visible. People came here when something had broken a body, a system, a long-running pretense that everything was fine, and the work of the place was repair, which was never as clean as it looked from the outside. Commendation was almost buried because of what you filed, she said. I know. My service record spent 4 years with a gap where the commendation should have been. I know. I left because I didn't want to fight a review board's impression of me that I couldn't see the full basis for. Closed his eyes briefly. I know that too. Do you know, she said quietly, that I was good at it? That what I did in that staging area was the right call, and that your decision, the one I overrode, would have resulted in at least one of those handlers dying before the medevac arrived. He opened his eyes. Yes, he said. I've known that since the day it happened. The room was very still. She exhaled through her nose. She picked up his chart again, checked the surgical notes, made a notation she'd been meaning to make about the pain management protocol, a practical, specific, clinical notation that had nothing to do with the conversation, and everything to do with the fact that she needed something to do with her hands. I'll send the folder back with Ward, she said. Sign. Laurel, sign it, Marcus. Whatever you owe me beyond that. She set the chart down. We can figure out the rest later. Right now, that's what matters. He looked at her. Okay, he said. She walked to the door. For what it's worth, he said. Behind her, you were the best medical technician I ever worked with. Before the end, in the middle of all of it, I said so in private 100 times. His voice was quiet. I just failed to say it where it counted. She stood at the door for a moment. She didn't turn around. I know, she said, and she left. She walked back to the nursing station with the deliberate pace of someone managing a lot of things at once, internally, that weren't visible from the outside. She sat down. She picked up a chart. She worked. Danny watched her for about 90 seconds and then said nothing, which was the right call. 4:15, the conference room door opened, and Bohm emerged with Okafor and Dunn. Fitch came out behind them, and his posture had changed, completely not defeated, but diminished in the way that a structure is diminished when the load-bearing elements have been questioned and found insufficient. Bohm walked directly to the nursing station. Ms. Voss, he said, do you have a moment? She looked up from the chart. Of course. They stood at the end of the nursing station, slightly apart from the flow of foot traffic, and Bohm spoke with the careful precision of a man who had been formulating sentences for the past 2 hours. Compliance review will proceed formally as of Monday, he said. Dr. Okafor's program will be submitting a full incident report to the Veteran Services Oversight Board, and Major Dunn's office will be completing the military record review in parallel. He paused. As part of that process, I've been made aware of certain aspects of your service history and qualifications that were not reflected in your personnel file here. That's accurate, she said. The hospital should have had access to your full qualifications at intake. He held her gaze steadily. That's a failure of our credentialing process, and it reflects poorly on how you've been deployed within this department. It does, she agreed, without making it harder than it needed to be. Bohm looked briefly uncomfortable, the discomfort of a man who was accustomed to institutional language and was finding that this particular conversation required something more direct. I owe you an apology, Ms. Voss. On behalf of this institution's administration, you were not used correctly, and you were not supported correctly. He paused. I'm going to make sure the record reflects what we should have known and acted on from the beginning. She looked at him. He was a careful, decent man who operated well inside institutional structures and less well outside them, and he was doing his best right now with information that had arrived faster than he'd had time to fully process. Thank you, she said. I appreciate that. He nodded and walked back toward the administrative wing. Across the room, Fitch had not moved. He was standing near the corridor that led to his office, and he was watching Bohm walk away. And then he was looking at Laurel, and the look had in it something she hadn't seen on his face before, not just awareness of consequence, specific, uncomfortable recognition of a person seeing themselves accurately for the first time in a while. He walked toward her. She waited. He stopped 3 feet away. I have a meeting with Bohm on Monday, he said. A formal one. I assumed you would. The review is going to cover my conduct over the past 8 months, not just the incident with the dogs. He said it, without inflection, informational, not self-pitying. The documentation you mentioned, the task reassignments. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. He looked like he was deciding something, and whatever it wasn't comfortable. I want to say something, and I want to say it now, before the formal process makes it look like I'm saying it because I have to. She waited. I treated you like you had a ceiling. he said. I decided what you were capable of before I had any evidence for it, and I used that decision to take advantage of your willingness to do the work without complaint. He paused. That was wrong. Specifically wrong, not generally wrong. I've been thinking about it since yesterday morning, and I can't make it something smaller than what it was. Laurel looked at him steadily. You were, she said. It was. He held her gaze. I know that's not enough. Start, she said. The rest is what comes after. He nodded slowly. He walked back toward his office. She watched him go. It was not satisfying in the way that satisfaction was supposed to feel, the clean, resolved satisfaction of a story finding its ending. It was messier than that. He was a complicated person who had done a wrong thing from a place of unchallenged assumptions rather than deliberate cruelty, which didn't make the wrong thing acceptable, but made the aftermath complicated in ways that simple villainy wouldn't have. She had spent 8 months being underestimated by a man who had never once considered that she might have depths he couldn't see. Now he could see them. And the process of that seeing was not going to be clean or quick. Fine. She had never expected clean. At 5:30, Ward reappeared at the nursing station. He had the folder with him. He set it on the desk in front of her without preamble. The 6th line had a signature on it. She looked at it for a moment. Then she closed the folder and set it aside. Monday, Ward said, Dunn will formally submit the commendation upgrade to the Federal Records Office. Processing takes approximately 3 weeks. He paused. After that, your service record will be complete, including the commendation tier. Okay. There's also the matter of the K9 program assessment. Okafor wants to move quickly on the handler-adjacent certification. She's talking to Boehm about restructuring your role to include the Veteran Wing K9 program formally. He watched her face. That would mean a role expansion, more responsibility, different visibility than you've had here. I know what it would mean. Are you comfortable with that? She thought about what she'd said to Fitch once, about visibility, that she hadn't come here to be seen, she'd come here to do the work. And that had been true, as far as it went. But there was a version of keeping yourself invisible that was about humility, and a version that was about hiding. And she had, somewhere in the past 8 months, let the two blur together in ways that hadn't served anyone, including herself. I'll manage, she said. Ward picked up his jacket. He paused before putting it on. For what it's worth, and I know I have no right to anything from you after what happened with the processing. I'm glad you're still doing it. He said it simply, without ornamentation. The work. This. He gestured at the hospital around them. Some people leave the service and never find another version of the thing they were good at. You found it. You just did it somewhere nobody knew to look. She looked at him. You should have pushed harder on the commendation, she said. Not angry, factual. Yes, he said. I should have. He held her gaze. I'm sorry. It was not the most she had ever needed from someone, and not the least. It was a man of 62 acknowledging a specific failure with the directness of someone who didn't have the luxury of time for anything less. Thank you, she said. He left. She finished her shift. She checked on Driscoll Payne at a 3, which she believed, and a new veteran wing patient in room 11 who was post-surgical and anxious, and she spent 12 minutes with him that weren't in her schedule because he needed them. She completed her chart notes. She handed off to the evening team and walked through the brief that never felt quite brief enough at end of shift. She was putting her jacket on at the nursing station at 7:12 when Danny came to stand beside her. How are you doing? Danny asked. Not performatively, actually asking. I'm tired, Laurel said. Honestly. Yeah. Danny leaned against the counter. That was a lot of day. It was a lot of week compressed into a day. Danny was quiet for a moment. Then, for what it's worth watching all of it, you handling it the way you did. She shook her head slightly. I've been a nurse for 14 years, and I've never seen someone manage that much pressure without either shutting down or blowing up. I've had practice. I know that now. Danny met her eyes. I should have pushed back on Fitch months ago. When he started handing you things that weren't yours. I saw it, and I complained to you about it, and I didn't actually do anything. She said it with the directness of someone who had been sitting with that admission and had decided to stop sitting with it. That was on me. Laurel looked at her. You're doing something now. Bit late. Better than not at all. Danny exhaled. Are you coming back Monday? I work Monday. Good. Danny straightened. Because apparently this hospital has been significantly misusing a decorated military medic for 8 months. And I'd like to see what it looks like when it stops doing that. Laurel picked up her bag. She was almost to the door when her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A number she didn't have saved area code she didn't immediately recognize. She almost didn't answer. She answered. Miss Voss, said a voice she didn't know, male. Professional. The clipped efficiency of someone accustomed to getting to the point fast. My name is Deputy Director Carl Weston. I'm with the VA Regional Oversight Division in Denver. I've been in contact with Major Dunn and Dr. Okafor today regarding the incident at Callaway Memorial. Yes, she said. I'm calling because the compliance review we're opening is broader than what Dunn may have indicated to you, based on what we've found in the preliminary documentation. A brief pause. There are aspects of the K9 program agreement at Callaway Memorial that suggest the incident yesterday was not an isolated event, but the most visible incident in a pattern of protocol non-compliance that extends back approximately 14 months. Stopped walking. What kind of non-compliance? That's what the review will establish formally. But I want you to be aware that your statement, combined with Vane's incident report and Okafor's behavioral documentation, has opened something considerably larger than a single incident report. He paused. And I want you to be prepared for the possibility that the review process will become visible, publicly visible, depending on what we find. Why are you telling me this tonight? Because tomorrow morning, we're notifying hospital administration of the expanded review scope, and the person who will receive that notification is not Bohm. She frowned. Bohm is the director, yes. Weston's voice was careful. He is. But the notification protocol for an expanded federal compliance review goes to the governing board, not the administrative director, which means the first person officially informed of the expanded scope will be the board chair. Who is the board chair? A pause. His name is Raymond Fitch, Weston said. He's held the position for 9 years. Parking lot was very quiet. Gerald Fitch's father, she said. Yes. She stood in the cold evening air, with the phone against her ear, and the weight of what she'd just heard settled into the full architecture of the past 8 months, with a clarity that was almost physical, the pattern completing itself, the shape becoming visible all at once, the particular sick logic of how a man had been able to treat a nurse like furniture for 8 months without a single institutional consequence, because the institution itself had a reason not to look. Ms. Voss, Weston said, I want to be direct with you. What happens Monday morning is going to be complicated. The board chair has a conflict of interest that will need to be formally declared before the review can proceed, which means there will be a period of procedural chaos, during which various people will be making various decisions about how to manage their exposure. He paused. I want you to be in this building Monday morning. I want you to have your documentation with you. She looked at the hospital behind her, the lights of the evening shift, the movement of figures past windows, the ordinary ongoing machinery of a place that had been, underneath its ordinary surface, considerably less ordinary than she'd understood. I'll be there, she said. She ended the call. She stood for another moment. Then she looked at her phone, and she called Danny, who picked up on the second ring. I need you to do something for me, Laurel said. Tonight, before you leave. What? Every non-role assignment Fitch gave me that you witnessed, I need you to write it down. Date, time, scope, who was present. As detailed as you can get it tonight while it's fresh. A silence. Then how bad is this going to be? For Fitch? Bad, Laurel paused. For the hospital? Complicated. And for you? She looked up at the sky, the flat dark of a Wyoming night, stars starting to come through where the cloud cover had broken. I don't know yet, she said, but I'm going to need people who saw what they saw to be willing to say so. I saw it, Danny said. I'll say so. Good. She put the phone in her pocket. Go home after. Get some sleep. She walked to her car. She sat in it without starting the engine. And she thought about Raymond Fitch, a name she'd never heard, a person she'd never considered, sitting at the top of the structure that had spent 8 months treating her like she didn't matter. A man whose son had been doing, for years, exactly what the institution permitted, because the institution had a reason to look the other way. She thought about Mac, pressing his shoulder against her leg in a rehabilitation suite. She thought about Marcus Holt's signature on the 6th line. She thought about Ward saying, "You just did it somewhere nobody knew to look." She started the engine. Monday was going to be something else entirely. She pulled out of the parking lot and drove through Fort Halston's quiet streets. And behind her the hospital glowed against the dark, and somewhere inside it, 3 retired military working dogs were sleeping in a suite she had prepared with her own hands, and one of them, the oldest one, the one who had been hardest to reach, was sleeping with the specific stillness of an animal that had finally, after a very long time, decided it was safe to rest. She drove home. She did not sleep well. But when her alarm went off at 5:45 Saturday morning, she reached for her phone before she reached for anything else, and she sent a message to Ward's number. The review is expanding. Raymond Fitch is board chair. Monday is going to be a different conversation than anyone's planning for. 3 minutes later, Ward replied with 2 words. I know. And then, after a pause long enough that she'd set the phone down, a second message arrived from a number she hadn't expected, not Ward's number, not Dunn's, not Weston's, a number she hadn't saved, but recognized immediately. Contacted me this morning, the message read. The Oversight Board in Denver. They want a formal account of what happened at the end of the deployment. Everything. A pause. Then Iaresi said yes. I thought you should know before they tell you. Marcus Holt. She looked at the message for a long moment. Then she set the phone face down on the nightstand and stared at the ceiling. In the quiet of her bedroom in the early morning dark, something that had been tightly wound for 4 years, not broken, not gone, just held under sustained pressure, shifted, very slightly, in the direction of something that might eventually become resolution. But eventually she got up, she made coffee. She sat at her kitchen table with Dunn's card and Ward's folder and a legal pad, and she began writing down everything she remembered. In order, from the beginning, in the precise and detailed language of someone who had been trained to document things accurately and had never, not once, lost that particular skill. She wrote for 2 hours. When she was done, she looked at what she'd produced. Then she picked up her phone and called Dunn. I have something for you, she said. All of it. The deployment account, the staging area incident, what Holt filed, what Ward's commendation was for. She paused. Everything I've been carrying for 4 years, Dunn said. I'll come to you. I'll be here. She hung up and looked out the kitchen window at the gray Wyoming morning overcast, the kind of sky that couldn't decide what it wanted to do, and she thought about what came after the accounting, what the process looked like from the other side of disclosure, what it cost, and what it gave back. She didn't have the full answer yet, but she had 2 hours of notes and a federal officer on her way, and Monday morning was 48 hours away, and Raymond Fitch did not yet know that the nurse his son had spent 8 months treating, like furniture, had been sitting on documentation that was about to become evidence in a federal compliance review. She refilled her coffee. She waited for Dunn's car to appear in the driveway, and outside, above the flat gray sky, the overcast began slowly, reluctantly, the way Wyoming weather always moved to break. Dunn's car pulled into the driveway at 8:14. Watched it from the kitchen window, a gray sedan, government plates, moving with the unhurried precision of someone who had not rushed, despite being called on a Saturday morning. She refilled her coffee, put a second cup on the counter, and had the door open before Dunn reached the step. Dunn came inside without ceremony. She sat at the kitchen table. She looked at the legal pad covered in Laurel's handwriting and did not reach for it. Immediately, she looked at it the way you look at something you've been told is significant before you've verified it yourself. How long did that take you? She asked. 2 hours. Dunn picked it up. She read in silence for several minutes, and Laurel drank her coffee and looked out the window at the breaking overcast and let her read without commentary. When Dunsen set it down, her expression had the quality of someone who had just had a suspicion confirmed in a way that was worse than the suspicion. Full account, Dunn said. Not a question. Everything I can document from memory. The sequence, the decisions, what Holt filed versus what actually happened, what Ward knew. She paused. It won't replace the formal record, but it's a foundation. It's more than a foundation. Dunn turned a page back, reading something again. Staging area incident, the specific sequence you've described here, is consistent with what Ward's commendation language implied, but didn't spell out. The review board that assessed Holt's report didn't have this level of operational detail. She looked up. They had. The additional scrutiny on your separation would never have been triggered. No, Laurel agreed. It wouldn't have. Which means 4 years ago, a deliberately incomplete account from one officer effectively buried a decorated medic's record. Dunn was quiet for a moment. Outside, a vehicle passed on the street, and the sound faded. and the morning settled back into its gray quiet. "I want to be honest with you about what the next few weeks look like," Dunn said. "The federal commendation upgrade will process. That's straightforward. Ward's documentation is clean, and my office has the authority to expedite, given the circumstances. Done by the end of the month." She folded her hands on the table. "The broader review, the Callaway Memorial compliance investigation. The board chair conflict of interest that's slower. Federal processes move at federal speed. You'll see partial results before you see final ones." "I understand that." "And Holt's formal account will be part of the deployment record review. That opens a separate process through the Army's Administrative Review Branch." She held Laurel's gaze. "Clear your record completely. But it will take time." "Time I have," Laurel said. Dunn picked up her own coffee. She looked at it for a moment, then at Laurel. "Can I say something that's outside my official capacity?" "Yes. I've been doing this work for 18 years. Reviews, compliance investigations, records corrections. I've seen a lot of people who had things done to them that shouldn't have been done." She paused. "Most of them spend a significant amount of energy being angry at the process. Timeline. At the fact that the repair takes longer than the damage did." She set the cup down. "You're not doing that. Getting angry at the timeline doesn't change it." "No. But most people do it anyway." Laurel looked at the legal pad. "I spent 4 years being angry," she said. Not loudly. "But I was. At Holt, at the review board, at the system, at myself for leaving instead of fighting." She paused. "At some point I had to decide whether I was going to keep spending energy on that or redirect it into something I could actually affect. And you chose Wyoming. I chose nursing. Wyoming was just where there was an opening." Dunn almost smiled. It was the first time Laurel had seen anything approaching humor on the Major's face, and it changed her considerably. "For what it's worth, whoever ended up with you in their trauma unit got something they didn't fully deserve, and clearly didn't properly appreciate." "Not yet," Laurel said. "But Monday's coming." Dunn left at 9:40 with the legal pad and a formal request for Laurel's written permission to include her account in the expanded review documentation. Laurel signed the request form on the kitchen table and handed it back and watched the gray sedan reverse out of the driveway and disappear down the street. Then she washed both coffee cups, put on her jacket, and drove to the hospital. Not because she was scheduled, because there were 3 dogs in a rehabilitation suite. And she had 2 days before Monday arrived, and she wasn't the kind of person who sat still when there was something she could be doing. Vane was there when she arrived, which didn't surprise her. He had the energy of someone who kept close to the things he was responsible for. He looked at her when she walked in, took in the fact that she was in civilian clothes and carrying nothing official, and said simply, "They've been good this morning." "Good." She went into the suite. She spent 90 minutes with the 3 dogs, not in any formal capacity, not as any kind of documented interaction. Just a woman sitting on the floor of a rehabilitation suite on a Saturday morning, while 3 retired military working. Dogs settled around her with the ease of long practice. She talked to them occasionally, in the low, specific way she had always talked to working animals, not baby talk, not commands, just the sound of a human voice being present without demanding anything. Mac fell asleep with his head on her knee. Griffin watched the door for a while, then let his eyes close. Sable lay on her back with her feet in the air, which was the least dignified position Laurel had ever seen a military working dog assume, and which made something in her chest loosen in a way that had nothing to do with professionalism and everything to do with the fact that some things, after a very long time, finally feeling safe enough to be ridiculous. She drove home. She ate something she actually cooked instead of something she assembled from whatever was in the refrigerator, which was an indicator she'd learned about herself that she was doing better than yesterday. She slept 8 hours, which she hadn't managed since Thursday. Sunday passed in the ordinary way of Sundays before something significant, slow, and slightly too quiet, with an undercurrent of waiting that didn't quite resolve. Monday arrived. She was in the building at 6:30. She had her documentation folder, Dunn's paperwork, her own notes, the copies she'd made of her task logs in her bag, and she had the specific, settled calm of someone who had done all the preparation that could be done and was now simply waiting for the thing to begin. The first indication that Monday was going to be what Weston had warned her it would be came at 7:50 when 2 people she didn't recognize walked through the main entrance with federal identification badges and went directly to the administrative wing without stopping at reception. Neither of them looked like they were there for anything routine. By 8:15, Director Bohm had been in 3 separate conversations with people who had arrived without appointments, and his expression had moved through several stages of carefully managed alarm. At 8:40, Fitch arrived. He walked in the way he always walked, with the cultivated authority of a man who had been the most important person in a room for a long time. He got halfway to his office before one of the federal officials intercepted him, and something passed between them that Laurel couldn't hear from the nursing station, but could read in the way Fitch's posture changed, the particular change that happens when a person realizes the landscape has shifted significantly since they were last standing in it. He looked briefly across the department. He found Laurel at the nursing station. She held his gaze steadily and then looked back at her chart because she had work to do, and the work didn't stop because the accounting was happening. The formal meeting convened at 9 o'clock in the administrative conference room. Bohm, the 2 federal officials, Okafor, Dunn, and a hospital board representative Laurel didn't recognize. Fitch was asked to attend. He went in with the posture of a man making a calculated decision about how to manage an exposure, and the door closed behind him. Danny appeared at Laurel's elbow. "It's happening." "Yes." "Are you going in there?" "I wasn't asked to be in there." She flipped to the next chart entry. "I was asked to be in the building," "which I am." Danny watched the conference room. "How long do you think it takes?" "As long as it takes." It took 3 hours and 11 minutes. When the door opened, it opened without ceremony, no dramatic exit, no visible confrontation. Just people emerging from a room where significant things had been decided, each carrying the weight of those decisions in their own way. Dunn walked out with the compact efficiency of someone who had gotten what she came for. Okafor followed, consulting her tablet. Bohm emerged last and paused in the doorway and rubbed his face with both hands in the gesture of a man who had spent 3 hours being forced to look at things he would have preferred to look at from a greater distance. Fitch came out second to last. He walked to his office. He did not look at the nursing station. 40 minutes later, Bohm came to find Laurel. He asked her to come to his office, and she went, and he sat across from her and spoke without preamble. "Gerald Fitch has been removed from his position as Chief of Emergency Services, effective immediately," he said. "He'll remain on staff in a clinical capacity, pending the completion of the formal review, but he has no administrative authority, no supervisory role, and no management access as of this morning." He paused. "Additionally, Raymond Fitch has recused himself from the hospital board pending a conflict of interest investigation. An external auditor will review the governance of this institution's relationship with the Veteran Services Program going back 14 months. Laurel sat with her hands folded in her lap. She had expected this, or something close to it, and having expected, it didn't make it feel like a movie climax. It felt like a long overdue correction reaching the stage where corrections actually register. K9 program agreement will be restructured under Okafor's oversight, Bohm continued. Part of that restructuring, a new role is being created, senior trauma nurse and veteran program liaison. Carries expanded scope, formal supervisory responsibilities for the veteran wing, and co-coordination of the K9 therapy program once your handler-adjacent certification is complete. He looked at her. "I'd like you to be in that role." "What does the expanded scope mean practically?" "It means you have clinical authority in your area of specialty. It means when you tell a department head that something is outside your role, there's a formal structure supporting that. It means your qualifications are reflected accurately in your responsibilities." He paused. "And it means the veteran patients in this hospital will be cared for by someone who actually understands what they've been through." She looked at him. He was a careful man trying to do a right thing in the aftermath of having failed to do it when it was less costly, which was not the same as doing it right the first time, but was also not nothing. "Yes," she said, "I'll take the role." Bohm exhaled, not dramatically, just the exhale of a man for whom something difficult had resolved. "Good." He stood up. "The formal documentation will be processed this week. In the meantime, the department is yours, in the interim, while we assess the transition." Stood up. "I'll need Danny Marsh as my senior floor coordinator." "Done. And I want the K9 suite made permanent. Not a pilot program, a standing feature of the veteran wing." Bohm looked at her for a moment. "I'll take that to Okafor." "Good." She moved toward the door. "Thank you, Director." She walked out before he could say anything else. The news moved through the department, the way news always moves through hospital departments, faster than it should be physically possible, through a combination of corridor conversations and the specific osmosis of institutional spaces where everyone is always half listening, even when they appear not to be. By lunchtime, the nursing floor knew that Fitch had been removed. By early afternoon, the full shape of it, the Federal Review, the board conflict, the expanded role had reached the version of the story that was mostly accurate with the edges slightly blurred. Danny found Laurel at the nursing station at 1:15 and stood there for a moment without speaking. "Senior floor coordinator," Laurel said, without looking up. "Was that?" "Yes." Danny made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob and was entirely characteristic of her. "You couldn't have said something before the official offer came down?" "I'm saying it now. I've been standing here for 30 seconds not knowing if—" "Danny." Laurel looked up. "Do you want the role?" "Obviously, yes." "Then we're done discussing it." She looked back at the chart. "I need you to coordinate the veteran wing census review this afternoon. Driscoll in 12 is due for his PT assessment reevaluation. And the new admission in room 11 needs his pain management protocol reassessed. The current one is inadequate, and the attending is being conservative for no reason I can identify." Danny stared at her. "You've been promoted to senior liaison, and you're already managing the veteran wing. I've been managing it informally for 2 months. Now it's official." She handed Danny the chart. "Go." Danny went. The afternoon ran. She did her job, her expanded job, her correctly scoped job, and it wasn't dramatically different from the job she'd been doing, except that when she made a clinical decision in the veteran wing, she made it as the person with the formal authority to make it, and that difference, while invisible from the outside, was considerable from the inside. At 3:30, she went to room 14. Marcus Holt was sitting up, which was more than he'd managed on Friday. Color was better. The chart indicated that the attending had finally adjusted the pain management protocol. She noted the timing and noted that it aligned with a recommendation she'd made in a nursing flag 2 weeks ago that had gone unaddressed until this morning. She didn't mention that. "The tibial fracture is tracking correctly," she said. "PT assessment Thursday." "I heard," he said. "And I heard the other thing." "Review?" "The promotion." He looked at her. "Ward texted me." "Ward texts?" Apparently he learned in retirement. A brief pause. "Congratulations, Laurel." She looked at him. He looked back. The room held the particular weight of two people who had a long and specific history and were navigating the version of each other that existed now rather than the one that existed then. "Your account," she said, "for the deployment review. Have they contacted you yet?" "Calls scheduled for Wednesday." He kept his voice even, but she could hear the thing underneath it, the cost of it, the necessary discomfort of saying plainly what he'd done and what it had produced. "Tell them everything." "I know you will." He looked at his hands. "It doesn't fix the 4 years." "No," she said. "It doesn't. But it fixes the record, and that's what the record needed." He was quiet for a moment. "Are you going to be okay with this? Working in the same building while I'm here?" She thought about that honestly, rather than reaching for the quick reassurance. "It's going to be what it is," she said finally. "You did something wrong. You admitted it. You're fixing what can be fixed. That's more than most people manage." She paused. "We're not going to be friends, Marcus. But we don't have to be enemies either." He nodded slowly. He looked like he'd expected less from her and was uncertain how to hold more. "Physical therapy will be harder than you think," she said. "The tibial fracture at your injury stage typically underperforms on initial mobility assessments and overcorrects on week 2. Don't push the week 2 session past what the therapist prescribes." He almost smiled. "Is that the official medical advice?" "That's the advice of someone who has watched 4 people with similar presentations overdo it in week 2 and spend an additional 3 weeks recovering from the overcorrection." She moved toward the door. "Don't be one of them." She left before he could respond. In the hallway, Howard Driscoll was being walked by a physical therapist, first supervised ambulation, 12 steps to the end of the hall and back, moving with the careful determination of a man who understood that getting back to himself required doing the unpleasant thing 1 step at a time. He saw her. 12 steps, he announced. "How does it feel?" 12 steps. He paused in front of her, catching his breath, without making a production of it. "I heard the news." "What happened with the other doctor?" "Word travels. In a hospital, it travels at the speed of light." He studied her face with the attention he always gave her. "You doing okay?" She thought about the question. She thought about Dunn's car in her driveway Saturday morning, and the legal pad, and 3 hours sitting on the floor of a rehabilitation suite, and a conference room door closing on a man's career, and a signed document on the 6th line. She thought about the folder in her bag, and the role that was now officially hers, and the dogs who were 40 feet down the veteran wing in a suite she had prepared with her own hands, sleeping in the uncomplicated way of animals, who had found the person they'd been looking for. Getting there, she said. He nodded, as if that was the exact right answer. Good. He started walking again, slow, deliberate, unassisted. Don't let them underestimate you again, Nurse Voss. I won't, she said. I promise. She watched him make the 12 steps and turn around and make them back, and something settled in her chest that had not been settled in a long time, not the clean resolution of a problem solved, because problems of this size don't solve cleanly. Specific, grounded weight of standing correctly in your own life, after a period of standing sideways in it. On Thursday of that week, she received 2 things. The first was a formal letter from the VA Regional Oversight Division confirming the initiation of the expanded compliance review, projected completion timeline, and the formal record that Raymond Fitch had recused himself from the hospital board pending the investigation's findings. Attached to the letter was a secondary document from the Army's Administrative Review Branch confirming receipt of Marcus Holt's formal account and the initiation of the deployment record review. The second was a call from Dunn. The commendation upgrade, Dunn said. Pushed it through express processing. You'll receive the official documentation by the end of the week. Laurel sat at her desk, in the corner of the veteran wing coordinator's office that was now formally hers, and looked out the window at the hospital parking lot. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me. Thank Ward for writing something compelling enough that the processing committee didn't argue. A pause. And for the record, what it says in that commendation. What you did in that staging area. It was the right call. I know, Laurel said. I've always known. Yes, Dunn said. I imagine you have. The call ended. She sat for a moment. Then she picked up the schedule on her desk and went back to work. 3 weeks later, on the first Friday of the K9 program's newly permanent status at Callaway Memorial, Sable Griffin and Mac walked through the veteran wing entrance at 9 in the morning with Vane and Fisk flanking them and a small group of staff and veteran patients watching from the corridor. The dogs moved with the calm of animals in a familiar place. Vane had told her the day before that the behavioral stability assessments from the past 3 weeks' best numbers that the program had recorded for all 3 animals since their separation, that Mac's food intake had normalized, that Sable had passed an acclimation protocol with a new handler contact that she'd previously failed twice, that Griffin had started doing the thing where he tried to lean on anyone who stood still long enough, which was, Vane said, with something close to warmth, a sign that he was trusting again. The veteran patients who'd been briefed on the program watched the dogs move through the wing with the specific, careful interest of people who had been around working animals and understood their language. A man in room 7, a former Army infantryman, 3 tours, recovering from spinal surgery, looked at Mac moving through the corridor and said nothing, but his face did something that his face had not done in the 2 weeks since his admission. Laurel stood at the nursing station and watched. When the dogs reached her, they did what they always did. Mac moved to her side and pressed his shoulder against her leg. Griffin sat at her feet. Sable, who was in the mood for no particular dignity today, leaned her entire weight against Laurel's hip with the confidence of an animal that had decided this was acceptable and was not interested in debate. Down the corridor, a veteran patient in room 4, a woman named Sergeant Vera Hollins, retired, recovering from a knee reconstruction, looked at the scene and said, "Who's she?" The nurse beside her said, "That's Laurel Voss. She's the veteran wing coordinator." Hollins watched Mac pressed against Laurel's side, Griffin at her feet, Sable's easy unguarded lean. She served? 8 years, Navy. Combat medic. Hollins was quiet for a moment. Then the quiet ones always have the longest records. Down the hall, Danny appeared from around the corner with a chart under her arm, and the expression she got when she was trying to not make a production of something, stopped next to Laurel. Dr. Albright just approved the pain management revision for room 11, she said. Good. 2 weeks late, but good. Also, Boehm's office called. The interim department structure becomes permanent at the end of the month. Your role is officially in the org chart. I know. I signed the paperwork Tuesday. Danny nodded. She looked at the dogs, then at Laurel, then at the veteran wing around them, the patients in their rooms, staff moving with new coordination, the morning light coming through the windows at the end of the hall in the way that hospital light sometimes did, making everything slightly more visible than it had been before. "Can I say something?" Danny asked. "You're going to regardless." 8 months, Danny said. "I watched you come in every day and do more than your job and say nothing and never make it about yourself. And I thought you were just that way. That you were built without a complaint mechanism." She paused. "It took me way too long to understand that you were choosing it. That the quiet wasn't the absence of something. It was a decision." Laurel looked at her. "You should have pushed back sooner," Laurel said, "when you saw it happening. I know, you had standing. You had seniority. You could have said something directly to Fitch, and it would have landed differently than it would from me. I know that too." Danny met her eyes without flinching. "The part I'm going to have to sit with." Laurel held her gaze for a moment. Then she said, "Sit with it, then. Learn from it, and do better next time you see it happening to someone else." She picked up the chart from the desk. "That's the point of the accounting. Not the punishment, the change." She walked toward the veteran wing. Behind her, Mac followed without being called. She heard Danny make a sound half exasperated, half something else, and then heard her walking away in the other direction, back to her own work, because there was always more work, always another chart, always another patient who needed something that required a person showing up and paying attention. That was the thing about hospitals that people on the outside sometimes missed. The work never paused for significance. You could be in the middle of something that mattered enormously personally, institutionally, historically, and the monitors still beeped, and the medication still needed to be reconciled, and the person in room 11 still had inadequate pain management, and someone had to go fix it. And the people who stayed, who kept showing up, day after day, in the middle of all of it, weren't the ones who'd never been knocked sideways. They were the ones who'd figured out to stay useful while they were healing. At 11:40, she got the email. It came from the VA Regional Records Office, with the subject line that Dunn had warned her to watch for. Record update confirmed Voss, Laurel A. Case No 7741 MC. She opened it. The language was federal and dense, and not particularly moving on its surface. Official confirmation of commendation upgrade. Formal entry into service record. Case closed with full documentation attached. She read it twice, the same way she'd read the document. Dunn had handed her in the hospital corridor, with the specific attention of someone who understood that paper and language and official processes were imperfect containers for significant things, but were also the only containers the world reliably had. She closed the email. She looked out the window of her coordinator's office at the Wyoming morning blue sky now. The overcast that had hung over everything for the past few weeks finally moved on, the mountains in the distance sharper than they'd been in weeks. Then she picked up her phone and called Ward. He answered on the second ring. "Came through," she said. "I know. They copied me." Pause. "How does it feel?" She thought about that honestly. She thought about what she'd expected it to feel like, the triumphant clarity of a wrong thing being made right, the closure of a chapter that had been open for 4 years. She thought about the gap between what it felt like in the imagination and what it felt like in the actual morning. Sitting at a desk in Wyoming with 3 military working dogs, 30 feet down the hall, and a department full of patients who needed someone to pay attention. "Like something I can put down now," she said, finally. Ward was quiet for a moment. "That's enough," he said. "That's more than enough." She ended the call. She sat for another minute. Then she stood up, straightened her lanyard, and walked out of the office and into the veteran wing. Mac was lying in the corridor outside room 7, the former infantryman who'd made a face when he saw him. The door was cracked. She could hear, through it, the low sound of a conversation, not the careful professional conversation of a patient and a medical provider, but the unguarded sound of a person talking to a dog, which required no credentials, no history, no explanation of what you'd been through or why it was still with you. She didn't go in. She stood in the corridor and listened to that sound, the ordinary, irreducible human thing of a person who had carried something for a long time, finding a moment where they could, for a little while, set it down. She knew what that felt like. She walked to the next room. There was work to do. There was always work to do. That was the thing she'd understood a long time ago in other rooms, in harder circumstances. that the work was not the consolation prize for the life you'd imagined. It was the life itself, the actual one, the version that existed in real time, with all its imperfections and inadequate pain management protocols and departments that took too long to see what was standing right in front of them. You showed up. You did the work. You stayed useful even when the institution around you wasn't. And if you were patient, not passive, not silent past the point of silence becoming complicity, but genuinely, strategically patient, eventually the truth found enough room to surface on its own. You just had to be there when it did. At the end of the shift, she went to the K9 suite for the last time that day. Vane and Fisk were packing up. The dogs were ready to go back to the program facility. The van was outside. The routine was established. The goodbyes were the matter-of-fact goodbyes of a routine that would repeat. Mac looked at her from across the room. She crossed to him. She crouched down. She put her hands on either side of his face and looked at him directly, the way she'd looked at him in a different room, in a different country, on a different day, that had cost them both something. Good work, she said quietly. His tail moved once. Slow, certain. She stood up. She nodded to Vane, who nodded back with the brevity of someone who had said everything that needed saying and saw no reason to repeat it. She walked to the door. Next Friday, Fisk said. Next Friday, Laurel confirmed. She walked out of the suite and down the corridor and through the veteran wing and out through the main entrance and into the parking lot, where the evening had arrived with the clean, cold clarity of a Wyoming sky after weeks of overcast. Stood in it for a moment. She thought about the woman who had walked into a hospital 8 months ago with a clean personnel file and no intention of being seen, and who had been seen anyway, first by 3 dogs who had never forgotten her, and then by a system that had been avoiding its own accounting, and finally, piece by piece, by the people around her who had been looking, but not quite understanding what they were looking at. She thought about what it had cost to stay quiet, what it had cost to finally stop. She thought about Driscoll saying, "Don't let them underestimate you again." She thought about what she'd said back, "I promise." She got in her car. She drove through Fort Halston in the early evening, past the gas stations and the diner and the stretch of highway that opened out toward the mountains, and she felt not the triumphant lightness of a movie ending, but the specific, grounded weight of a person who has done something difficult correctly and is beginning to find out what life looks like on the other side of it. It wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect. There were still processes running, reviews unfinished, a man in room 14 relearning how to carry his own history with honesty, a department adjusting to a new structure, a hospital board working out the cost of having looked the other way. None of it was clean. But she was in it correctly, fully, with her whole record, and her whole self and her name on the right paperwork at last, and that was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. The mountains held the last light of the day as she drove west. Behind her, in a hospital on the edge of a Wyoming town, a K9 suite sat empty and ready and waiting for Friday. A man in room 7 was sleeping better than he had in weeks. A woman named Hollins was doing her physical therapy with the methodical focus of someone who had decided to come back all the way. Howard Driscoll was walking 12 steps, then 16, then 20, each one a small particular act of will. And somewhere in that building, in the structure of a place that had finally been made to account for itself, the name Laurel Voss appeared in an org chart with the title it should have carried from the beginning. Not because she'd shouted, not because she'd demanded, because she'd done the work, kept the record, waited for the truth to find its room, and when the moment came, she'd been exactly where she needed to be. Quiet, ready, immovable.